It's 1932, and Australia is gearing up for war. The government is mobilizing troops, deploying machine guns, and preparing for a military campaign that would go down in history. Newspapers are buzzing with anticipation. Citizens are rallying behind their brave soldiers. The enemy, well, let's just say it wasn't exactly what you'd expect. In 1932, Australia went to war. Not against another country, not against rebels, not even against particularly aggressive kangaroos. No, Australia declared war against birds. Big, flightless, incredibly stubborn birds with attitude problems and zero respect for property lines. And here's the spoiler that makes this story absolutely legendary. Australia lost. Spectacularly. Embarrassingly. So thoroughly that the birds basically took a victory lap around the wheat fields, while the Australian military packed up their machine guns and went home to write very awkward reports. But to understand how a modern military force could be defeated by creatures that can't even fly, we need to go back to the beginning. We need to understand how Australia in 1932 had become the perfect storm of economic desperation, political promises, and ecological chaos that would set the stage for one of history's most ridiculous conflicts. The Great Depression hits down under. Let's start with the elephant in the room, or should I say the emu in the wheat field. By 1932, Australia was deep in the grips of the Great Depression, and it was hitting the country like a sledgehammer to the economic face. When most people think of the Great Depression, they picture bread lines in New York or dust bowls in Oklahoma. But Australia was getting absolutely walloped by the same economic tsunami, and in some ways, it was even worse. The numbers tell a story of national catastrophe. Wheat prices, which had been a respectable £1.30 per bushel in the late 1920s, had crashed to a devastating 2 shillings per bushel by 1932. For those not fluent in Old British currency, that's a drop from about $6.50 to roughly 50 cents in today's money. Imagine if your salary suddenly became less than 1/10 of what it was yesterday. That's essentially what happened to Australian wheat farmers, who went from moderately comfortable to financially obliterated almost overnight. But it gets worse. Unemployment had skyrocketed to 30% in some areas, turning entire communities into ghost towns where the only thriving businesses were the pawn shops and the establishments that served very cheap alcohol. The government was struggling so hard to support its citizens that politicians were basically playing musical chairs with increasingly empty treasury coffers, all while trying to maintain the facade that everything was under control. In Western Australia, the situation was particularly dire. The state's economy was heavily dependent on wheat farming and mining, both of which had been decimated by the global economic collapse. Farmers who had been living comfortable lives just a few years earlier were now facing bankruptcy, foreclosure, and the very real possibility of losing everything they'd worked for. It was the kind of desperate situation that makes people do desperate things, like asking the government for help, which, as we'll see, led to some very interesting consequences. The soldier settlement scheme. Now let's talk about one of those government schemes that sounds absolutely brilliant in theory, but turns into a complete disaster in practice. After World War I ended in 1918, Australia, like many countries, was faced with the challenge of what to do with hundreds of thousands of returning soldiers. These men had served their country bravely, survived one of the most brutal conflicts in human history, and deserved to be rewarded for their sacrifice. The Australian government's solution was the soldier settlement scheme, which sounds like exactly the kind of forward-thinking, patriotic program that any reasonable person would support. The idea was simple: give returning soldiers land to farm, allowing them to build new lives as productive agricultural contributors to the nation's economy. It was supposed to be a win-win situation. Veterans get a fresh start, Australia gets more agricultural production, and everyone lives happily ever after. The reality, as is often the case with government programs designed by people who have never actually farmed anything more challenging than a desk plant, was somewhat different. Between 1917 and 1929, approximately 5,000 ex-soldiers were given farming plots in Western Australia. On paper, this looked like a massive success story. In reality, it was more like a slow-motion agricultural catastrophe that nobody wanted to admit was happening. The problem wasn't with the soldiers. These were tough, determined men who had survived trenches, gas attacks, and conditions that would make most modern people curl up in a corner and cry. The problem was with the land itself. You see, when the government was handing out these farming plots, they had a tendency to give away what was essentially the agricultural equivalent of leftovers. Most of the good, fertile, easily farmable land had already been claimed by established farmers or was too expensive for the government to purchase. So the soldier settlers got what was left. Marginal land in remote areas that was difficult to farm, poorly connected to markets, and generally the kind of property that experienced farmers had looked at and said, "No thank you, I'll try my luck elsewhere." Imagine being promised a beautiful suburban home and instead being given a fixer-upper in the middle of a swamp, 50 miles from the nearest grocery store, with no road access and a foundation made of quicksand. That's essentially what happened to many of these veteran farmers. They were given plots that were too small to be economically viable, too remote to efficiently transport crops to market, and too marginal to produce reliable harvests even in good years. By 1932, many of these soldier settlers were already struggling financially. They'd invested their life savings, their government loans, and years of backbreaking labor into farms that were barely breaking even in the best of times. Then the Great Depression hit, wheat prices collapsed, and suddenly these men who had survived a world war found themselves facing a different kind of battle, one against bankruptcy, foreclosure, and the crushing realization that their government's grand plan had essentially set them up for failure. Western Australia's ecological perfect storm. But wait, there's more. Because apparently economic disaster and poorly planned agricultural policy weren't enough challenges for these already struggling farmers. Nature decided to join the party, and she brought friends. Big, feathered, hungry friends with absolutely no respect for private property or human agricultural ambitions. Western Australia in the 1930s was an ecological powder keg waiting to explode. The state features a vast wheat belt that stretches across hundreds of thousands of acres of what was, until recently, pristine bushland. This wheat belt wasn't just good for growing grain, it was also absolutely perfect habitat for emus during their breeding season. And by perfect, I mean, it was like someone had designed a 5-star resort specifically for large, hungry birds with a taste for cultivated crops. For thousands of years, emus had been following traditional migration patterns across this landscape. Every year, like clockwork, they would move inland from the coastal areas during their breeding season, following ancient routes that had been established long before the first European ever set foot on Australian soil. These migrations were part of a delicate ecological balance that had worked perfectly well for millennia. Then humans showed up with their bright idea of turning hundreds of thousands of acres of native bushland into wheat fields. Now, emus aren't particularly bright birds, but they're smart enough to recognize a good deal when they see one. Instead of spending their days foraging for scattered seeds and tough native plants, they suddenly had access to vast fields of delicious, carefully cultivated wheat that was conveniently planted in neat, easily accessible rows. It was like replacing a scavenger hunt with an all-you-can-eat buffet. The emus didn't need to be told twice, but here's where the situation gets really interesting from an ecological perspective. Human settlement wasn't just providing emus with better food sources, it was actually disrupting their natural migration patterns in ways that made the problem significantly worse. Traditional emu routes had been disrupted by fences, roads, and settlements, which meant that the birds were being funneled into smaller areas where they had fewer options for feeding and breeding grounds. Think of it like this. Imagine you're used to having access to 100 different restaurants spread across a large city. Suddenly, 90 of those restaurants close, and the remaining 10 are all located on the same street. Everyone who used to eat at the closed restaurants is now crowding into that one street, creating massive lines, food shortages, and general chaos. That's essentially what happened to the emu population in Western Australia, except instead of restaurants, it was feeding grounds. And instead of lines, it was massive flocks of increasingly desperate birds. The wheat belt had become an ecological bottleneck, concentrating emu populations in areas where they would have maximum impact on human agricultural activities. It was the perfect recipe for conflict, and by 1932, all the ingredients were in place for a confrontation that nobody saw coming. The perfect storm brewing. Let's take a step back and appreciate the sheer absurdity of the situation that was developing in Western Australia by late 1932. You had economically desperate farmers trying to make a living on marginal land during the worst economic crisis in modern history. You had a government that was politically committed to supporting these farmers, but financially unable to provide meaningful assistance. And you had an increasingly large population of emus who had discovered that human agricultural activity had essentially created a massive, convenient feeding ground right in the middle of their traditional territory. It's like someone had designed a situation specifically to create maximum chaos and then sat back to watch what would happen. The farmers needed every grain of wheat they could grow to survive economically. The emus needed food to survive, period, and the wheat fields represented the best feeding opportunity they'd encountered in their evolutionary history. The government needed to be seen as supporting the farmers, but lacked the resources to address the underlying economic problems that were making everyone desperate. And here's the beautiful part. Nobody was really the villain in this story. The farmers weren't asking for anything unreasonable. They just wanted to be able to harvest the crops they'd worked all year to grow. The emus weren't being malicious. They were just following their natural instincts to find food and breed successfully. The government wasn't being deliberately incompetent. They were just dealing with an unprecedented economic crisis while trying to honor promises made to war veterans. But sometimes, when you combine economic desperation, ecological disruption, and political pressure, you get situations that spiral out of control in ways that nobody could have predicted. Sometimes you get situations where reasonable people make increasingly unreasonable decisions. And sometimes, just sometimes, you get situations where a modern military finds itself at war with a bunch of birds. The humorous reality check. Now let's pause for a moment to appreciate the cosmic humor of what was about to unfold. Here's an analogy that perfectly captures the absurdity of the soldier settlement situation. Imagine promising someone a dream home, then giving them a plot in the middle of a highway during rush hour. Except the rush hour lasts for months, and instead of cars, it's 20,000 6-foot-tall birds with attitudes and absolutely no respect for traffic laws. That's essentially what the Australian government had done. They'd promised returning war heroes a chance at agricultural prosperity, then given them land right in the middle of one of nature's busiest migration highways. And the traffic on this highway consisted of enormous, fast-moving birds who had recently discovered that stopping for snacks was not only allowed, but actively encouraged by the abundance of delicious wheat. The farmers were like homeowners who suddenly realized their dream house was located in the middle of Times Square during New Year's Eve. Except instead of celebrating humans, it was hungry emus, and instead of one night, it was every breeding season for the foreseeable future. By November 1932, the situation had reached a critical point. Farmers were reporting massive crop losses, with some areas experiencing damage to 90% or more of their harvest. These weren't just statistics. These were the livelihoods of men who had already sacrificed years of their lives serving their country and were now watching their economic futures disappear under the feet of birds who seemed to take positive delight in destroying months of hard work. The political pressure was mounting. Local newspapers were running headlines about the emu menace and demanding government action. Farmers were organizing delegations to Perth, presenting politicians with detailed reports of crop damage and financial losses. The opposition was asking pointed questions about what the government planned to do about this unprecedented agricultural crisis. And in the halls of government, bureaucrats and politicians were trying to figure out how to deal with a problem that nobody had ever encountered before. How do you protect agricultural crops from a massive migration of large, fast-moving birds? How do you balance the needs of struggling farmers with the practical realities of wildlife management? How do you maintain political credibility when your agricultural policy is being systematically destroyed by creatures that can't even fly? The answer, as we'll see, was to treat it like a military problem, because when you're a government with hammers, every problem starts to look like a nail. Even when the nail is actually 20,000 emus with home field advantage and centuries of evolutionary experience in outsmarting larger predators. But before we get to the military solution and its spectacularly entertaining consequences, we need to properly meet the other side of this conflict. We need to understand exactly what the Australian military was about to go up against. We need to meet the emus, meet the enemy, the emu empire, nature's perfect chaos machines. If you're going to declare war on an animal, it's probably a good idea to understand what you're up against. Unfortunately for the Australian military, they were about to learn this lesson the hard way. Because emus, as it turns out, are not just big birds. They're not just fast birds. They're They're nature's perfect chaos machines, designed by evolution to be absolutely spectacularly good at surviving in harsh environments and adapting to unexpected challenges. And in 1932, the unexpected challenge was machine guns. Emu Biology 101. Understanding your feathered opponent. Let's start with the basics, because emus are genuinely impressive creatures that deserve respect, even before we get to the part where they humiliated the Australian military. These birds are the second largest in the world, standing up to 6.2 feet tall when they decide to stretch their necks and look intimidating. That's tall enough to look most humans directly in the eye, which is exactly as unsettling as it sounds when you're facing down a flock of them across a wheat field. But height is just the beginning. Emus weigh between 80 and 130 pounds, and every ounce of that weight is pure muscle, attitude, and evolutionary stubbornness. They're not fat, fluffy birds like some of their cousins. They're lean, mean, running machines that look like they were designed by someone who really understood the principles of aerodynamic efficiency, but decided that flying was for weaklings. Their legs alone are mechanical marvels. Emus can run up to 30 miles per hour, which means they can outrun most humans, most dogs, and apparently most military strategies. Their stride can cover up to 9 feet at full gallop, turning them into feathered freight trains that can cover vast distances without breaking stride. When an emu decides it wants to be somewhere else, it's going to get there. And there's not much you can do to stop it short of building a very large wall or accepting that your plans have just changed. But here's where emus get really interesting from a military perspective. Their feathers. Emu feathers aren't like the neat, organized plumage you see on most birds. Each emu feather has 2 shafts instead of 1, creating a loose, fluffy structure that looks almost fur-like. This isn't just an aesthetic choice by evolution, it's practical armor. Those double-shaft feathers create a thick, dense layer of protection that can deflect small projectiles, thorns, and other hazards that an emu might encounter while running full speed through rough terrain. Essentially, emus come equipped with natural body armor. Nobody told the Australian military this before they started shooting at them. Dr. Shane Maloney from the University of Western Australia has conducted extensive research on emu anatomy and physiology, and his findings help explain why these birds are so remarkably resilient. Their cardiovascular system is incredibly efficient, allowing them to maintain high speeds over long distances without the kind of fatigue that would stop most animals. Their bone structure is optimized for impact resistance, which means they can run full speed into obstacles that would cripple other creatures and basically bounce off like feathered ping-pong balls. But perhaps most importantly, their nervous system is designed for rapid response to threats. Emus can detect danger, assess the situation, and react with startling speed. Their reaction time to sudden threats is measured in fractions of seconds, which is significantly faster than the time it takes a human to aim and fire a weapon. In a conflict situation, this means emus can start moving before their opponents have finished deciding what to shoot at. The Great Migration of 1932, when 20,000 birds decided to visit. Now that we understand what individual emus are capable of, let's talk about what happens when you get 20,000 of them together and point them toward the same destination. Because the Great Emu Migration of 1932 wasn't just a wildlife phenomenon, it was like nature's version of a military invasion, complete with coordinated movement, strategic timing, and an unconscious but devastatingly effective battle plan. Every year during the breeding season from October to December, emus follow ancient migration patterns that take them from the coastal areas of Western Australia inland to their traditional breeding grounds. This isn't a casual stroll. This is a massive, coordinated movement of birds, following routes that have been established over thousands of years. It's like a natural highway system, except the traffic consists entirely of large, determined birds with a single-minded focus on reaching their destination. In 1932, this migration coincided perfectly with the wheat harvest season. The timing couldn't have been worse from a human perspective, or better from an emu perspective. Just as farmers were preparing to harvest the crops they'd spent all year growing, nature delivered an estimated 20,000 emus directly into the heart of Western Australia's agricultural region. From the emus' point of view, this was like discovering that someone had built a massive, all-you-can-eat buffet right along their traditional travel route. The wheat fields stretched for miles in every direction, filled with perfectly ripe grain that was just waiting to be harvested. Except now, instead of human farmers doing the harvesting, it was thousands of birds who had no concept of property rights and no interest in leaving anything for the people who had planted the crops. George Pierce, a farmer in the Campion district, provided what might be the most succinct summary of the situation when he reported losing entire crops overnight. Not damaged crops, not partially eaten crops. Entire crops that simply disappeared under the feet and beaks of visiting emus. Farmers would go to bed looking at fields of golden wheat ready for harvest, and wake up to find bare ground and very satisfied-looking birds. The scale of the crop damage was staggering. In some areas, farmers reported losses of 90% or more of their expected harvest. These weren't minor inconveniences. These were economic catastrophes for people who were already struggling to survive during the Great Depression. The emus weren't just eating food, they were destroying livelihoods, dreams, and the financial futures of families who had already sacrificed everything to make their farms work. But here's the thing that made the situation even more challenging. The emus weren't just eating and moving on. They were settling in, establishing territories, and treating the wheat belt like their new permanent residence. Why would they leave? They had discovered agricultural paradise, complete with unlimited food, water sources, and convenient shelter. From their perspective, humans had thoughtfully prepared a perfect habitat and then invited them to move in. Emu warfare tactics, accidental military genius. Now here's where the story gets really interesting from a military strategy perspective. Emus didn't set out to wage war against Australian farmers. They didn't develop battle plans or coordinate attacks or establish command structures. They were just being emus, following their natural instincts and adapting to their environment the way evolution had taught them. But their natural behaviors happened to be perfectly suited for what military strategists would recognize as highly effective guerrilla warfare tactics. It was like they had read Sun Tzu's The Art of War and decided to implement every principle with ruthless efficiency. Let's start with their hit-and-run feeding patterns. Emus don't graze like cattle or sheep, staying in one area until they've consumed everything available. Instead, they move in fast, concentrated attacks on specific areas, consume what they want, and then disperse before anyone can organize an effective response. They would appear in a wheat field at dawn, spend a few hours systematically destroying crops, and then vanish into the landscape before farmers could organize any kind of counterattack. This wasn't a planned military strategy, it was just efficient feeding behavior. But from a tactical perspective, it was absolutely brilliant. The emus were essentially conducting raid warfare, hitting targets of opportunity and then disappearing before their opponents could mount an organized defense. Their intelligence gathering was equally impressive, though completely unintentional. Emus quickly learned to recognize and avoid human countermeasures. Farmers would set up scarecrows, noisemakers, and other deterrents, and the emus would study these obstacles for a day or two before figuring out they were harmless and ignoring them completely. It usually took less than 48 hours for emus to adapt to any new defensive measure, which meant farmers were constantly playing catch-up in an arms race they were destined to lose. But perhaps most effective was their psychological warfare capabilities. Emus produce deep, booming calls that can carry for miles across the Australian landscape. These calls serve various purposes in emu society: mating displays, territorial claims, communication between scattered flock members. But for farmers, horses, cattle, and eventually soldiers, these sounds became harbingers of agricultural doom. Imagine lying in bed at night and hearing those deep, resonant calls echoing across your wheat fields. You know that those sounds mean that hundreds or thousands of large, hungry birds are currently in the process of destroying your livelihood. You know that by morning, weeks or months of work might be completely ruined, and you know that there's essentially nothing you can do to stop it. The psychological impact on farmers was devastating. These were tough, experienced men who had dealt with droughts, floods, market crashes, and every other challenge that agricultural life could throw at them. But they had never faced an enemy that was simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, that could appear without warning and disappear just as quickly, and that seemed to take genuine pleasure in destroying everything they had worked to build. Even more unsettling was the emus' apparent indifference to human authority. These birds had no fear of people, no respect for property lines, and no interest in negotiations or compromise. They would stand 30 yards away from angry farmers, stare directly at them with those large, intelligent eyes. and then deliberately continue eating wheat, as if to say, yes, we know you're upset, no, we don't care, this is our wheat now. The infrastructure sabotage was perhaps the most economically damaging aspect of emu behavior. Western Australia's agricultural region was crisscrossed with rabbit-proof fences designed to protect crops from the smaller but equally destructive rabbit population. These fences represented massive investments in agricultural infrastructure, and they were reasonably effective at keeping rabbits out of farming areas. Emus, however, treated these fences like minor inconveniences. They would run through wire fencing, creating gaps that not only allowed them to access protected crops, but also provided convenient entry points for rabbits, foxes, and other agricultural pests. A single emu flock could damage miles of fencing in a few hours, creating repair bills that often exceeded the value of the crops they were trying to protect. From an economic warfare perspective, this was devastatingly effective. The emus weren't just destroying current crops, they were systematically undermining the infrastructure that farmers needed to protect future crops. It was like they were conducting a comprehensive campaign to make agriculture economically unsustainable in their territory. The perfect biological war machine. Let's pause for a moment to appreciate what the Australian military was about to go up against. Emus are basically velociraptors that survived the asteroid, got really good at running, and developed a taste for wheat. They're like that friend who shows up uninvited to your dinner party, eats everything, breaks your furniture, and somehow makes you feel bad about being upset. But unlike that annoying friend, emus come equipped with millions of years of evolutionary refinement that has turned them into nearly perfect survival machines. They're fast enough to outrun most predators, tough enough to survive in harsh environments, smart enough to adapt quickly to new challenges, and social enough to coordinate their activities in ways that multiply their individual effectiveness. Their natural habitat is the Australian outback, which means they're already adapted to extreme heat, limited water, rough terrain, and scarce food sources. The wheat belt, by comparison, was like a luxury resort. Unlimited food, reliable water sources, and terrain that was much easier to navigate than their traditional territory. They weren't just surviving in this environment, they were thriving in ways that made them increasingly bold and confident. From a military perspective, emus possessed several crucial advantages that nobody fully appreciated until the shooting started. They had superior mobility, allowing them to choose when and where to engage. They had detailed knowledge of the terrain, having spent months exploring every inch of the wheat belt. They had no centralized command structure that could be targeted or disrupted. They had no supply lines that could be cut, and they had absolutely nothing to lose since they were already fighting for their survival in a changing landscape. Most importantly, they had numerical superiority and home field advantage. There were 20,000 of them, and only a handful of soldiers. They knew the territory intimately, while the military was operating in unfamiliar terrain. They were fighting for food and breeding rights, while the soldiers were fighting for, well, that was never entirely clear. The Emu Intelligence Network. One of the most underestimated aspects of EMU society is their communication and coordination abilities. These aren't solitary animals that just happen to be in the same place at the same time. Emus have complex social structures and sophisticated communication systems that allow them to share information across large distances and coordinate group activities. Their calls aren't just noise, they're a complex language that can convey information about food sources, danger, breeding opportunities, and territorial boundaries. When emus in one part of the wheat belt discovered a particularly good feeding area, word would spread through the population faster than most humans could organize a response. When they detected threats, warning calls would alert birds across miles of territory within minutes. This meant that farmers and eventually soldiers were dealing not with individual animals acting independently, but with a highly networked intelligence system that could adapt and respond to human activities with surprising speed and coordination. Every time humans tried a new strategy, the emu network would analyze it, develop countermeasures, and share that information throughout the population. It was like trying to fight an enemy that had perfect intelligence gathering, instant communication, and collective memory. Every mistake humans made was noted, analyzed, and prepared for. Every successful emu tactic was shared and refined. The learning curve favored the emus heavily because they were operating as a collective intelligence while humans were working as isolated individuals. The stage is set for war. By November 1932, the situation in Western Australia had escalated beyond what anyone had imagined possible. What had started as a routine agricultural pest problem had evolved into something that resembled an invasion by a foreign army. Farmers were reporting daily battles with organized flocks of emus that seemed to operate with military-level coordination and strategy. The birds had established territorial control over large areas of the wheat belt. They had developed effective counters to every human defensive measure. They had superior mobility, better intelligence, and complete commitment to their cause. They were winning every engagement through superior tactics that they had developed without any formal military training, and they were doing it all while just trying to eat some wheat and find suitable places to raise their young. The Australian government was facing a crisis that defied conventional solutions. Traditional pest control methods were completely ineffective against an enemy this large, this fast, and this intelligent. Economic incentives were meaningless to creatures that didn't understand money. Diplomatic negotiations were impossible with animals that didn't speak English and had no interest in compromise. The farmers were desperate, the politicians were embarrassed, and the newspapers were having a field day with stories about the emu menace that was bringing Australian agriculture to its knees. Something had to be done, and it had to be done quickly, decisively, and with enough force to demonstrate that humans were still in charge of the Australian continent. The solution, as we'll see in the next chapter, was to treat this as a military problem requiring a military solution. Machine guns would surely be effective against large, flightless birds. Professional soldiers would easily outmaneuver and defeat creatures that had never faced modern weaponry. Military discipline and training would triumph over animal instinct and chaos. It was a perfectly reasonable plan that made complete sense to everyone who proposed it. The emus, of course, had different ideas about how this was going to work out. But before we get to the actual combat, let's take a moment to appreciate the sheer audacity of what was about to happen. A modern military force, equipped with machine guns and trained in the latest techniques of warfare, was about to engage in formal combat operations against an army of birds who had no idea they were about to become participants in one of history's most ridiculous military campaigns. The emus were simply going about their daily business of eating wheat and making more emus. They had no grand strategy, no military objectives, and no understanding that their natural behaviors had been classified as acts of war by the government of Australia. They were about to accidentally demonstrate that sometimes the most effective military force is the one that doesn't know it's fighting a war. The Great Emu War. In the annals of human hubris, few chapters are as delightfully absurd as the period when Australian farmers found themselves locked in what can only be described as an agricultural Cold War with 20,000 six-foot-tall birds. By November 1932, the wheat farmers of Western Australia had discovered something that would make even the most seasoned military strategist pause for thought. Emus are apparently better at guerrilla warfare than most humans, and they had not even read Sun Tzu. The situation had escalated beyond mere inconvenience into what agricultural historians now regard as one of the most comprehensive defeats of human ingenuity by sheer feathered determination. It was as if Mother Nature had decided to play the ultimate practical joke on humanity, creating a scenario where all the tools of civilization, from scarecrows to shotguns, would prove utterly useless against an enemy that communicated through deep booming sounds and whose primary battle strategy appeared to be eating everything in sight while maintaining perfect formation. The farmers of Western Australia, men who had survived the Great War, the Great Depression, and the great challenge of making wheat grow in some of the most unforgiving soil on Earth, now found themselves completely outmaneuvered by creatures whose main evolutionary achievement was running very fast in the wrong direction. These were hardened agricultural veterans who could coax crops from dirt that looked more suitable for growing rocks. Yet they stood helpless as their life's work disappeared down the gullets of birds who seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to appear wherever they were least wanted and disappear the moment anyone showed up with anything resembling a weapon. The irony was not lost on anyone paying attention. Here were farmers who had spent decades learning to work with nature, understanding weather patterns, soil composition, and seasonal cycles, only to be completely blindsided by nature's decision to mobilize what amounted to a feathered army with an appetite for destruction that would make a plague of locusts seem like polite dinner guests. The emus had essentially turned the entire wheat belt into their personal all-you-can-eat buffet, and they were approaching the task with the enthusiasm of teenagers at a pizza party and the organizational skills of a military logistics unit. What made the situation particularly maddening was the emus' apparent intelligence. These were not random acts of agricultural vandalism committed by mindless birds following basic instincts. The emus displayed tactical awareness that suggested they had either evolved specifically to torment wheat farmers or had somehow acquired a working knowledge of military strategy. They would approach farms in coordinated groups, post sentries while the main force fed, and retreat in perfect formation the moment any threat appeared. It was as if they had attended some sort of avian military academy and graduated with honors in advanced crop destruction. The scope of the disaster became clear as damage reports poured in from across the wheat belt. In the Campion district, farmers reported crop losses that ranged from substantial to apocalyptic, with some areas experiencing a 90% destruction rate. Imagine spending an entire year nurturing wheat from seed to harvest, watching it grow through seasons of drought and plenty, calculating the exact moment of optimal harvest, only to wake up one morning and find that your entire crop had been systematically devoured by what looked like a convention of oversized ostriches with attitude problems. The Walgulan area fared even worse, if such a thing were possible. Here, entire harvests simply vanished overnight, leaving behind fields that looked like they had been hit by a particularly selective natural disaster that had somehow managed to consume every grain of wheat while leaving the surrounding landscape completely untouched. Farmers who had mortgaged their futures on successful harvests found themselves staring at empty fields that resembled nothing so much as vast outdoor dining rooms where 20,000 uninvited guests had shown up for dinner and forgotten to leave. The financial implications were staggering. Damage estimates exceeded £10,000, a figure that would translate to roughly $500,000 in today's currency. For farmers already struggling through the Great Depression, this was not merely an inconvenience, but a potential death sentence for their agricultural enterprises. These were men who counted pennies and made every shilling stretch, who had learned to repair equipment with wire and prayer, who could make a single bag of seed last longer than seemed physically possible. The idea of losing thousands of pounds worth of crops to birds was so financially devastating that it transcended mere economic hardship and entered the realm of existential crisis. What made the situation even more frustrating was the complete failure of every conventional solution that human ingenuity could devise. Farmers had spent generations developing techniques for dealing with agricultural pests, from insects to rabbits to various forms of wildlife, but the emus seemed to exist in a category entirely their own. Every traditional method of pest control failed not just partially but spectacularly, as if the emus had somehow acquired immunity to everything in the farmer's arsenal of defensive measures. Scarecrows, those stalwart guardians of crops throughout human history, proved about as effective against emus as stern letters written to hurricanes. The birds approached these traditional deterrents with what appeared to be amused curiosity, examined them briefly, as if evaluating the craftsmanship, and then proceeded to ignore them completely while methodically devouring everything in sight. Some farmers reported that the emus seemed to use scarecrows as convenient perches from which to survey their next targets, adding insult to agricultural injury by literally looking down on the farmers' attempts at defense. The failure of scarecrows led to increasingly desperate attempts at noise-based deterrence. Farmers tried everything from cowbells to mechanical noisemakers, creating a cacophony that could be heard for miles around. For a few blissful days, it seemed as though the strategy might work. The emus appeared startled by the unusual sounds and kept their distance from the protected fields. Farmers began to hope that they had finally found the solution to their feathered nightmare. Unfortunately, the emus possessed something that the farmers had not counted on: adaptability that bordered on the supernatural. Within days, the birds had not only grown accustomed to the noise but seemed to be using it as a dinner bell. They would arrive at the sound of the noisemakers, as if responding to a formal invitation, apparently having concluded that wherever humans were making loud sounds, there was probably something worth eating nearby. The irony of noise deterrents actually attracting the very pests they were designed to repel was not lost on farmers who were rapidly running out of both crops and patience. Fencing represented the next logical step in the escalating arms race between human determination and emu persistence. Farmers who had successfully used fences to control cattle sheep, and other livestock, assumed that the same principles would apply to birds, even unusually large and determined ones. They constructed barriers that would have been perfectly adequate for containing any reasonable animal, using techniques that had been refined over generations of agricultural experience. The emus responded to these fencing efforts with what can only be described as casual disdain. Rather than being deterred by the barriers, they seemed to view them as minor inconveniences to be overcome through various creative methods. Some emus simply ran around the fences, displaying a tactical awareness that suggested they understood the concept of flanking maneuvers. Others discovered that the fences had gaps or weak points that could be exploited, often caused by the same rabbit infestations that had plagued farmers for decades. Most infuriatingly, some emus appeared to simply run through the fences, using their considerable size and momentum to create their own entrances wherever they deemed convenient. The sight of emus casually breaching fortifications that had taken considerable time and money to construct was perhaps the moment when many farmers realized they were not dealing with an ordinary pest control problem. These birds were not randomly wandering into agricultural areas and accidentally causing damage. They were conducting what amounted to systematic raids on human food production, and they were doing it with a level of coordination and intelligence that challenged every assumption about animal behavior. Hunting parties represented the final conventional solution that farmers could attempt before admitting that they were completely out of their depth. Groups of farmers would band together, armed with whatever weapons they could muster, and set out to reduce the emu population through direct confrontation. These expeditions were organized with all the seriousness of military campaigns, complete with reconnaissance, coordination of timing, and careful planning of approach routes. The results were consistently humiliating for the human participants. Individual farmers, even working in groups, found themselves completely outmatched by organized flocks of emus that seemed to possess an uncanny ability to detect threats and respond accordingly. The birds would scatter at the first sign of approaching hunters, but not in the panicked, disorganized manner that might be expected from wild animals. Instead, they dispersed in coordinated patterns that suggested some form of communication and tactical planning that the farmers could neither understand nor counter. Even more frustrating was the emus' apparent ability to learn from these encounters and adapt their behavior accordingly. Each hunting expedition became progressively less effective as the birds developed countermeasures to human tactics. They began posting sentries while the main flocks fed, establishing early warning systems that would make military communications specialists proud. They learned to recognize the signs of approaching humans from considerable distances and developed retreat patterns that maximized their chances of survival while minimizing the disruption to their feeding schedules. The failure of hunting parties to make any significant impact on the emu population was perhaps the most demoralizing development in the entire crisis. These were men who had grown up hunting, who understood animal behavior, who possessed the skills and equipment necessary to successfully pursue game animals. Yet they found themselves consistently outwitted by birds, whose primary evolutionary adaptations seemed to be running fast and eating everything in sight. As conventional solutions failed one after another, the farmers' frustration grew into something approaching desperation. They had exhausted every option in their traditional arsenal of pest control methods, and the emu population showed no signs of diminishing. If anything, the birds seemed to be growing more confident and aggressive, as if they had somehow understood that human defenses were proving ineffective and had decided to press their advantage. The political implications of the agricultural crisis could not be ignored indefinitely. Farmers throughout the affected regions began organizing themselves into deputations, formal groups that would travel to Perth to petition the government for assistance. These were not casual requests for help, but carefully organized political pressure campaigns designed to force government action on what was rapidly becoming a regional economic disaster. The deputations represented a significant escalation in the conflict between farmers and government bureaucracy. The farmers were not simply asking for financial assistance or agricultural advice. They were demanding that the government take direct action to solve a problem that had proven beyond the capabilities of private citizens. The petitions painted a picture of agricultural communities under siege, of hardworking families facing financial ruin through no fault of their own, of an environmental crisis that threatened the economic foundation of entire districts. The media response to the emu crisis began slowly but gathered momentum as the scope of the problem became apparent. The Sunday Times, along with other regional newspapers, began covering what they initially termed the emu menace, with the kind of attention usually reserved for natural disasters or economic crises. The coverage struck a balance between serious reporting on the financial implications of crop losses and barely concealed amusement at the absurdity of the situation. Newspaper reporters discovered that the emu crisis possessed all the elements of a perfect news story: economic drama, human interest, political implications, and an inherent absurdity that made it impossible to ignore. Headlines began appearing that would have seemed like satirical inventions if they had not been reporting on actual events. The idea of farmers being systematically defeated by birds struck readers as simultaneously tragic and comic, creating a news phenomenon that transcended mere regional interest. The political context of the crisis could not be separated from the broader agricultural challenges facing Western Australia during the Great Depression. The Country Party, which would later become the National Party, represented the interests of rural communities and found itself under increasing pressure to deliver tangible solutions to the EMU problem. Rural voters, who formed a crucial constituency for the party, were demanding action from their elected representatives. The political pressure created by the EMU crisis represented a perfect storm of electoral considerations, economic necessity, and public expectation. Government officials found themselves in the impossible position of needing to take action against what was essentially a natural phenomenon while maintaining their credibility with voters who expected results. The situation was complicated by the fact that traditional government responses to agricultural problems, such as financial assistance or policy changes, were completely inadequate to address a crisis that involved direct physical confrontation with wildlife. Election cycles added urgency to the political calculations surrounding the emu crisis. Politicians who failed to respond effectively to farmer demands risked electoral consequences in rural districts where agricultural interests dominated voting patterns. The pressure to do something became overwhelming, even when the available options ranged from inadequate to absurd. The famous quote attributed to farmer George Pierce perfectly captured the surreal nature of the situation. The emus have formed a sort of guerrilla warfare, and it has been impossible to make any effective use of the machine guns. This statement, made before the military intervention had even begun, demonstrated that at least some farmers had already grasped the fundamental problem that would plague all human efforts to combat the emu invasion. Pierce's observation about guerrilla warfare was remarkably prescient, revealing an understanding of the tactical situation that government officials and military planners would take weeks to appreciate. The emus were not conducting random raids or following simple instinctual patterns. They were engaging in what amounted to coordinated military operations with clearly defined objectives and sophisticated execution. The reference to machine guns being ineffective proved to be prophetic, anticipating the failures that would soon make the entire crisis a subject of international amusement. The implications of Pierce's statement extended far beyond mere agricultural commentary. He was essentially arguing that the emus had developed military capabilities that exceeded the technological solutions available to human defenders. This was not a problem that could be solved through superior firepower or advanced equipment. It was a tactical challenge that required understanding an enemy whose capabilities and motivations were completely outside normal human experience. Military intervention. Operation Emu. The decision to deploy military resources against agricultural pests represented one of those moments in history when rational decision-making processes collided head-on with political necessity, creating outcomes that future generations would regard with a mixture of bewilderment and amusement. By November 1932, the emu situation had escalated beyond the realm of agricultural problem-solving and entered the rarefied territory of matters requiring government intervention at the highest levels. The political pressure that had been building throughout the crisis reached a crescendo as farmer deputations, media coverage, and electoral considerations combined to create an irresistible demand for dramatic action. Government officials found themselves in the unenviable position of needing to respond to a crisis that had no precedent in administrative experience and no obvious solution in policy manuals. The farmers were demanding results, the media was demanding answers, and the voters were demanding that someone, somewhere, do something about the birds that were eating Western Australia's agricultural future. On November 2, 1932, Minister of Defense Sir George Pearce made a decision that would echo through history as one of the most unusual military deployment orders ever issued by a democratic government. In authorizing military assistance to deal with the emu crisis, Pearce was essentially declaring war on wildlife, a concept so unprecedented that the military bureaucracy had no existing procedures for handling such a situation. The official justification for military intervention was carefully crafted to sound both reasonable and routine. Government announcements described the deployment as a military exercise combined with a pest control operation, language that suggested a straightforward training mission that would simultaneously address a regional agricultural problem. The terminology was designed to minimize controversy while maximizing the appearance of competent government action. The unofficial reality, however, was far more complex and considerably more desperate. Political pressure had reached levels that made inaction impossible, regardless of the practical challenges involved in deploying military resources against animals. The media attention had transformed a regional agricultural problem into a national political issue, and electoral considerations demanded visible government response. The decision to use military force represented not a carefully considered tactical choice, but a political necessity that had overwhelmed rational planning processes. The choice of military intervention revealed the fundamental disconnect between political decision-making and practical problem-solving that would characterize the entire EMU campaign. Politicians who had never confronted an aggressive EMU were making strategic decisions about wildlife management, while military officers trained in human combat were being asked to develop tactics for fighting birds. The inevitable result was a collision between political expectations and biological reality that would produce outcomes satisfying to no one except future historians seeking examples of governmental overreach. The selection of personnel for Operation Emu reflected both the military's attempt to take the mission seriously and the complete absence of any relevant experience in the armed forces for dealing with large-scale bird management. Major G.P.W. Meredith of the Royal Australian Artillery was chosen to command the operation, a decision that made perfect sense within the context of military hierarchy and command structure, while making absolutely no sense within the context of actually solving the EMU problem. Major Meredith brought impressive credentials to his new assignment. He was a decorated veteran of the Great War, a man who had demonstrated courage under fire and leadership capability in the most challenging circumstances that military service could provide. His experience in conventional warfare was extensive and distinguished, covering everything from artillery tactics to troop management to strategic planning. He understood the complexities of military logistics, the importance of intelligence gathering, and the principles of tactical deployment that had been refined through centuries of human conflict. Unfortunately, Major Meredith's military education had not included courses in ornithology, animal psychology, or wildlife management. His experience in conventional warfare, while impressive, was based entirely on conflicts involving human opponents who followed recognizable patterns of behavior and responded to conventional military pressure. The tactical principles that had served him well in France during the Great War were about to encounter an enemy that had never read military manuals and showed no inclination to follow established rules of engagement. The irony of appointing a decorated human combat veteran to lead a campaign against birds was not lost on observers who understood both military culture and the realities of wildlife behavior. Meredith was being asked to apply tactical principles developed for fighting intelligent, organized, technologically equipped human enemies against creatures whose primary military assets were speed, numbers, and an apparent complete indifference to human authority. It was roughly equivalent to appointing a naval commander to lead a cavalry charge, a fundamental mismatch between expertise and mission requirements. Meredith's supporting personnel, Gunner J. O'Halloran and Gunner L.B. Riggs, brought similar qualifications and similar limitations to the operation. They were competent military professionals with experience in artillery operations and small unit tactics, men who understood equipment maintenance, ammunition management, and the coordination required for effective military action. They had been trained to operate complex weapon systems under stressful conditions and to maintain discipline and effectiveness in challenging circumstances. What they had not been trained for was tracking highly mobile targets across vast agricultural landscapes, adapting to enemies that could scatter in seconds and regroup in minutes, or maintaining morale while engaging in what amounted to the world's most expensive and least effective hunting expedition. Their military training had prepared them for conflicts where success could be measured in terms of territory captured, enemy casualties inflicted, and strategic objectives achieved. The EMU campaign would provide none of these traditional metrics for military success. The arsenal assembled for Operation Emu reflected both the military's commitment to bringing adequate firepower to the engagement and a fundamental misunderstanding of the tactical challenges involved in fighting emus. 2 Lewis machine guns represented state-of-the-art, small arms technology, weapons that had proven their effectiveness in the trenches of France and were capable of delivering sustained, accurate fire against multiple targets. The .303 caliber ammunition was powerful enough to stop human opponents at considerable distances and had demonstrated its lethality in various military conflicts. 10,000 rounds of ammunition suggested a serious commitment to the mission and reflected military planners' expectation that the operation would require sustained engagement over an extended period. This was not a token gesture or a brief demonstration of government concern. It was a full-scale military deployment with enough firepower to conduct a small war. The ammunition allocation indicated that military planners anticipated engaging large numbers of targets and expected to achieve decisive results through superior firepower and sustained pressure. The military truck provided mobility and logistics support, allowing the operation to move quickly between engagement sites and to transport personnel and equipment across the vast agricultural areas where emus were causing damage. The vehicle represented the military's recognition that this would not be a static defensive operation, but would require rapid deployment and tactical flexibility. The truck also provided a platform for mounting the machine guns and served as a mobile command post for coordinating operations. The confidence level of the military personnel assigned to Operation Emu was, by all accounts, extremely high. From the perspective of experienced soldiers, the mission appeared to be straightforward and the odds of success overwhelming. They possessed superior firepower, advanced technology, tactical training, and organizational discipline. Their opponents were unarmed birds with no technological capabilities and no apparent military training. The outcome seemed so predetermined that the primary challenge appeared to be preventing excessive casualties among the EMU population. The actual preparedness of the military force for EMU warfare was, unfortunately, practically zero. The tactical planning was based on assumptions about enemy behavior that would prove completely incorrect. The equipment selection reflected priorities that had little relevance to the actual challenges involved, and the strategic objectives were defined in terms that made meaningful success impossible to achieve. The entire operation was designed to fight an enemy that existed only in the imagination of military planners who had never encountered an organized emu flock. The initial strategy developed for Operation Emu demonstrated both the logical approach that military thinking brings to tactical problems and the complete irrelevance of that logic when applied to wildlife management. The plan was elegantly simple and would have been perfectly effective against any reasonable enemy that followed predictable patterns of behavior and responded appropriately to displays of superior force. Phase 1 called for locating large flocks of emus through reconnaissance and intelligence gathering. This seemed like a reasonable first step, reflecting standard military practice of identifying enemy positions and assessing their strength before engaging. The planners assumed that emus would congregate in predictable locations, maintain relatively stable positions, and be observable through conventional surveillance methods. The phase was designed to provide the intelligence foundation necessary for successful tactical operations. Phase 2 involved setting up machine gun positions in locations that would provide maximum effectiveness against the identified EMU concentrations. This reflected sound tactical thinking about fields of fire, defensive positioning, and the advantages of prepared positions in military engagements. The planners anticipated that emus would approach the machine gun positions in patterns that would allow for systematic engagement, providing opportunities for sustained fire and maximum effectiveness. Phase 3 called for systematic elimination of the EMU population through coordinated application of firepower. This represented the core of the military solution to the agricultural problem. Overwhelming force applied systematically until the enemy was neutralized. The planners expected that superior firepower would produce rapid results and that emu casualties would quickly reach levels that would solve the agricultural crisis. Phase 4, though unofficial, was the victory parade that everyone assumed would follow the successful completion of the previous 3 phases. This represented the political payoff for military intervention, the moment when government officials could demonstrate to farmers and voters that decisive action had produced tangible results. The victory parade existed more in the realm of political fantasy than military planning, but it reflected the expectations that had driven the decision to deploy military resources in the first place. The military approached Operation Emu with the same systematic thinking that had been applied to every other tactical challenge in their experience. They analyzed the problem, identified the resources required, developed a coordinated plan, and prepared to execute with the precision and determination that had characterized their previous military operations. From their perspective, they were applying proven methods to a new type of target, adapting their tactical expertise to meet the unique requirements of the EMU situation. The comparison to D-Day planning, while humorous in retrospect, accurately captured the seriousness with which the military approached their new assignment. They were applying the same methodical analysis and careful coordination that had been used for major military operations, bringing to bear all the organizational capabilities and technological resources available to address what they perceived as a straightforward tactical problem. The fact that their enemy consisted of large birds rather than human soldiers seemed like a detail that would make the mission easier rather than more challenging. The assumption that defeating emus would be simpler than fighting human opponents reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of the tactical advantages that the birds possessed. Military planners had extensive experience fighting enemies who used technology, followed command structures, operated from fixed positions, and responded predictably to displays of force. They had no experience dealing with enemies who possessed superior mobility, perfect local knowledge, instantaneous communication, and complete indifference to demonstrations of technological superiority. The question, "How hard could it be?" would soon prove to be one of the most prophetic rhetorical questions in military history. The emus were about to provide a comprehensive answer that would challenge every assumption about military effectiveness and demonstrate that some opponents cannot be defeated through conventional applications of firepower and tactical doctrine. The birds were preparing to teach the Australian military lessons about unconventional warfare that would become case studies in military academies for generations to come. The stage was set for one of the most unusual military campaigns in modern history, a conflict that would pit human technology and tactical thinking against natural selection and evolutionary adaptation. The humans brought superior firepower, advanced equipment, and systematic planning to the engagement. The emus brought 20,000 years of survival instincts, perfect knowledge of local terrain, and an organizational structure that had been refined through countless generations of avoiding predators while maximizing food acquisition. The outcome of this confrontation would surprise everyone involved, challenge fundamental assumptions about military effectiveness, and provide future historians with one of the most entertaining examples of governmental overreach in the 20th century. Operation Emu was about to begin, and the birds had no idea that they were about to win their first and only war against a modern military force. The Great Emu War: First Contact, Tactical Evolution, and the Rise of Feathered Supremacy. In the annals of military history, few conflicts have provided as much unintentional comedy as the Great Emu War of 1932. What began as a straightforward pest control operation quickly devolved into a masterclass in how not to conduct warfare against an enemy that refuses to follow conventional military doctrine. The events of early November 1932 would forever change how Australia viewed both its military capabilities and the intelligence of large flightless birds. The story of first contact between the Australian military and the emu forces reads like something from a satirical novel, yet every detail is meticulously documented in official military reports. Major GPW Meredith, a decorated veteran of the Great War, approached the emu problem with the same tactical mindset that had served him well against human adversaries. Unfortunately for the Major, emus had never read the manual on how defeated enemies were supposed to behave. The morning of November 2nd, 1932, dawned clear and bright over the Western Australian wheat belt, with conditions that any military planner would describe as ideal for the commencement of operations. Major Meredith had spent the previous evening reviewing his strategy, confident that the coming day would mark the beginning of the end for the emu menace that had been plaguing local farmers. The Lewis machine guns had been cleaned and tested, ammunition supplies verified, and reconnaissance reports indicated substantial enemy concentrations in the target area. At approximately 0800 hours, Major Meredith positioned his forces overlooking a section of wheat field near Campion, where intelligence reports suggested regular emu activity. The morning reconnaissance proved immediately fruitful when lookouts spotted a flock of approximately 50 emus engaged in what appeared to be routine foraging operations. From a tactical standpoint, the situation could hardly have been more favorable. The birds were grouped together in open terrain, completely unaware of the military presence, and well within effective range of the Lewis guns. The tactical setup proceeded according to textbook principles. The Lewis gun was positioned to provide optimal fields of fire while maintaining concealment from the target area. Ammunition belts were prepared and checked, with gunners taking their positions according to standard operating procedures. Target acquisition confirmed approximately 50 birds in a relatively compact formation, presenting what military manuals would classify as an ideal target of opportunity. At 0830 hours, Major Meredith gave the order to commence firing. The Lewis gun opened up with its characteristic rapid-fire chatter, sending .303 caliber rounds downrange toward the unsuspecting emu formation. What happened next would have been entirely predictable to anyone familiar with animal behavior, but came as something of a shock to military planners accustomed to human enemies who tend to take cover when fired upon. The emus did not take cover. Instead, they scattered in every conceivable direction with a speed and agility that would have impressed track and field coaches worldwide. The birds displayed an almost supernatural ability to change direction mid-stride while maintaining remarkable velocity, creating what observers later described as an explosion of feathers and dust that made accurate follow-up shots nearly impossible. When the dust settled and the gun crew conducted their battle damage assessment, the results were decidedly mixed. Approximately 12 emus lay motionless in the wheat field, representing what military analysts would calculate as a 24% casualty rate against the original target formation. From a purely statistical standpoint, this could be considered a tactical success, albeit one with significant room for improvement in terms of ammunition efficiency. Major Meredith's initial assessment, dutifully recorded in his official report, characterized the engagement as a tactical victory with noted areas for operational enhancement. The enemy had been engaged successfully, casualties inflicted, and the remaining forces driven from the immediate area. By conventional military standards, the operation had achieved its primary objectives and could be considered a qualified success. However, what Major Meredith could not have anticipated was the speed with which his feathered adversaries would adapt to the new tactical situation. Within hours of the first engagement, reports began filtering in from across the region that suggested the emu forces were already implementing significant changes to their operational procedures. The emu counter-strategy, accidental genius. The speed with which the emu population adapted to the introduction of machine gun fire into their environment would have impressed military strategists and animal behaviorists alike, had either group been paying attention at the time. Within 24 hours of the initial engagement at Campion, observers noted fundamental changes in emu behavior patterns that suggested a level of tactical sophistication that caught human forces completely off guard. The most immediately observable change was the dissolution of large flocking behavior. Where previously emus had gathered in substantial numbers for feeding and movement, they now operated in much smaller groups, typically numbering between 5 and 15 individuals. This tactical adaptation effectively neutralized the primary advantage of machine gun fire, which relies on engaging concentrated targets to achieve maximum efficiency. Even more remarkably, the birds appeared to have implemented a sentinel system that would have done credit to human military forces. Older, more experienced emus took positions on elevated ground or at the periphery of feeding areas, maintaining constant vigilance while their companions foraged. These sentries demonstrated an uncanny ability to detect human activity at considerable distances and would issue warning calls that resulted in immediate dispersal of all birds in the area. The communication system employed by the emus proved to be far more sophisticated than military planners had anticipated. The birds utilized a complex series of calls that appeared to convey specific information about the nature and direction of threats. Modern research by animal behaviorist Dr. Gisela Kaplan has confirmed that emus possess remarkable cognitive abilities, including the capacity to learn from single traumatic experiences, communicate complex information through vocalizations, and adapt behavioral patterns within hours of encountering new threats. The speed of this adaptation became apparent during subsequent engagements when human forces discovered that their standard operating procedures were no longer effective against an enemy that had learned to anticipate and counter their tactics. The level of human frustration began to rise proportionally as it became clear that they were facing an adversary that refused to cooperate with conventional military doctrine. By November 4th, just 2 days after the initial engagement, the tactical situation had evolved considerably. Intelligence reports indicated the presence of a large emu formation near Campion, prompting Major Meredith to authorize a full assault preparation. Gun crews were positioned, ammunition supplies verified, and approach routes reconnoitered in preparation for what was expected to be a decisive engagement against a substantial enemy force. The reality, however, proved disappointingly different from the intelligence reports. When human forces moved into position for the anticipated major engagement, they discovered only 12 emus in the target area, a far cry from the large formation that had been reported. This discrepancy between intelligence reports and ground truth would become a recurring theme throughout the campaign, suggesting that the birds had learned not only to avoid detection, but also to manipulate human intelligence gathering efforts. Despite the reduced target size, Major Meredith made the tactical decision to engage the available enemy forces, rather than abort the mission. 40 rounds were expended in the subsequent engagement, with minimal casualties inflicted on the emu forces. More disturbingly, from a military perspective, the surviving birds did not flee in panic as they had during the initial engagement, but instead walked away from the area with what observers described as casual indifference to the continuing gunfire. Major Meredith's report on this engagement contained the first official acknowledgement of enemy tactical sophistication, noting that the birds displayed what he characterized as extreme cunning in their response to military pressure. This assessment would prove to be remarkably prescient, as subsequent events demonstrated that the emu forces were indeed learning and adapting at a rate that exceeded human planning cycles. The implications of this rapid enemy adaptation were not immediately apparent to military planners, who continued to operate under the assumption that persistence and firepower would eventually overcome what they perceived as instinctive animal behavior. This fundamental misunderstanding of their adversary's capabilities would prove to be a critical factor in subsequent tactical failures. At this point in the campaign, it became clear that the conflict had evolved beyond a simple pest control operation into something resembling actual warfare between two intelligent adversaries. The emus had demonstrated tactical flexibility, rapid adaptation to changing conditions, and what appeared to be coordinated defensive strategies. Human forces, meanwhile, found themselves increasingly frustrated by an enemy that refused to behave according to established military doctrine. The humorous aspect of the situation was not lost on contemporary observers, though it would take several more engagements before the full scope of the tactical challenge became apparent. In retrospect, the emus were probably conducting their own version of after-action reviews, with experienced birds sharing lessons learned with younger members of the flock. One can almost imagine the conversations taking place in the wheat fields during the evening hours, with veteran emus explaining to newcomers the importance of maintaining proper spacing, posting sentries, and implementing immediate action drills when the distinctive sound of machine gun fire echoed across the landscape. The war intensifies. Tactical evolution. The first week of November 1932 marked a period of intensive tactical evolution for both sides of the conflict, though it quickly became apparent that one side was adapting considerably faster than the other. While Major Meredith and his men struggled to develop effective countermeasures to increasingly sophisticated emu tactics, their feathered adversaries continued to demonstrate a remarkable capacity for learning and adaptation that confounded military expectations. Human forces attempted to adapt their approach through the implementation of mobile tactics designed to overcome the emu's newfound wariness of static machine gun positions. The theory behind this tactical shift was sound, By maintaining mobility and conducting surprise attacks, military forces could prevent the birds from adapting to predictable patterns of engagement. Unfortunately, this strategy failed to account for the emus' superior knowledge of local terrain and their increasingly sophisticated early warning systems. The birds, meanwhile, continued to refine their defensive strategies with each passing day. Scatter responses became faster and more coordinated, with individual birds capable of achieving maximum velocity within seconds of receiving warning calls from sentinel birds. Group sizes remained small and dispersed, making it difficult for human forces to achieve the concentrated target presentations necessary for effective machine gun employment. Environmental factors began to play an increasingly significant role in determining tactical outcomes. The harsh Australian sun created severe overheating problems for the Lewis guns, which had been designed for European climate conditions rather than the intense heat of the Western Australian wheat belt. Dust and sand particles, stirred up by both human movement and emu activity, found their way into gun mechanisms with alarming regularity, causing frequent jamming incidents that left human forces vulnerable during critical moments of engagement. Perhaps most troubling from a military perspective was the noticeable decline in soldier morale as the campaign progressed. Veteran gunners who had successfully engaged human enemies during the Great War found themselves increasingly frustrated by an adversary that seemed to anticipate their every move while remaining seemingly invulnerable to conventional tactics. The psychological impact of repeated tactical failures against an enemy, previously dismissed as mere agricultural pests, cannot be overstated. The most significant engagement of this period occurred on November 8th, during what would later be known as the Great Chase. Intelligence reports indicated the presence of a massive emu formation numbering over 1,000 birds, representing the largest concentration of enemy forces detected since the beginning of operations. The tactical situation appeared ideal for a decisive engagement that could potentially break the back of emu resistance in the region. Major Meredith positioned his forces to take maximum advantage of the open ground between human positions and the enemy formation. The field of fire was clear, range was optimal, and visibility conditions were excellent. From every conventional military perspective, the stage was set for a devastating blow against enemy forces that could not possibly escape the concentrated firepower about to be brought to bear against them. The engagement commenced with textbook precision, with gunners achieving target acquisition and beginning systematic fire against the massed emu formation. Initial results appeared promising, with multiple birds observed falling under the concentrated machine gun fire. However, after only 12 rounds had been fired, the Lewis gun experienced a complete mechanical failure that brought the engagement to an abrupt halt. While human forces worked frantically to clear the weapon malfunction and restore it to operational status, the emu forces demonstrated their evolved tactical sophistication. Rather than fleeing in panic as they had during earlier engagements, the birds began a leisurely dispersal that maximized their survival chances while minimizing human opportunities for effective follow-up fire. By the time the weapon had been restored to working order, the target area contained only a handful of birds, with the vast majority having disappeared into the surrounding landscape. The final casualty count from this engagement was deeply disappointing from a military perspective. Despite facing the largest concentration of enemy forces encountered during the campaign, human forces had inflicted minimal casualties while expending precious ammunition supplies. The tactical advantage that should have resulted from superior firepower and positioning had been completely negated by equipment failure and superior enemy tactical adaptation. Major Meredith's growing concern about what he characterized as the emus' apparent invulnerability began to creep into his official reports during this period. The birds seemed capable of absorbing casualties while maintaining unit cohesion and continuing their agricultural depredations with minimal disruption. More troubling still was the mounting evidence that they were actively learning from each engagement and implementing increasingly sophisticated countermeasures. Emu psychological warfare. Perhaps the most unsettling development during this phase of the campaign was the emergence of what could only be described as psychological warfare tactics employed by the emu forces. These behaviors appeared to be deliberately designed to intimidate and demoralize human forces while demonstrating emu superiority in the tactical environment. The birds began approaching human settlements with increasing boldness, appearing at closer and closer distances to military positions and civilian areas. This behavior represented a complete reversal of normal wild animal behavior patterns and suggested a level of tactical sophistication that human forces had not anticipated. The emus seemed to understand that their mere presence created anxiety and uncertainty among their human adversaries. The most documented incident of emu psychological warfare occurred when a group of approximately 20 birds positioned themselves exactly 50 yards from a machine gun position and remained motionless for 30 minutes. The birds made no attempt to feed or engage in normal behavioral patterns, instead maintaining constant visual contact with the human position in what could only be interpreted as a deliberate intimidation display. The effect on human morale was immediate and significant. Soldiers reported feeling unnerved by the birds' apparent fearlessness and their seeming ability to assess human capabilities and limitations. The psychological impact of facing an enemy that refused to show appropriate fear of superior firepower began to undermine confidence in the entire military operation. This period also marked the beginning of serious media attention to what was rapidly becoming an embarrassing military situation. The first newspaper reports of military difficulties appeared on November 9, 1932, marking a significant shift in public perception of the operation. Headlines began changing from supportive coverage of military efforts to tackle the emu menace to more critical assessments of human tactical failures. The shift in media coverage reflected a growing public fascination with the apparent tactical superiority being demonstrated by the emu forces. What had begun as a routine pest control operation was rapidly evolving into a source of national amusement and international attention. The public reaction was a mixture of concern about agricultural damage and genuine amusement at the military's apparent inability to overcome a collection of flightless birds. Political pressure began mounting as opposition parties seized upon the military difficulties as evidence of broader governmental incompetence. Parliamentary debates began featuring questions about military effectiveness and the wisdom of deploying armed forces against agricultural pests. The operation that had been intended to demonstrate governmental responsiveness to rural concerns was rapidly becoming a political liability. Major Meredith's assessment of the tactical situation during this period, preserved in his official reports, provides remarkable insight into the military mindset when confronted with an enemy that refused to conform to conventional expectations. His observation that if the military had a division with the bullet-carrying capacity of the emus, it would face any army in the world, demonstrated both his growing respect for his adversaries and his frustration with conventional military doctrine when applied to unconventional warfare situations. The comparison of emus to tanks in terms of their apparent invulnerability to machine gun fire was particularly telling, as it represented official military acknowledgement that standard infantry tactics were proving ineffective against the current enemy. This assessment would prove prophetic as subsequent engagements continued to demonstrate the limitations of conventional firepower against a highly mobile, rapidly adapting adversary operating in familiar terrain. Equipment challenges continued to plague human forces throughout this period, with environmental conditions proving as formidable an enemy as the emus themselves. Lewis guns continued to experience overheating problems in the Australian sun, while dust and sand particles created persistent mechanical reliability issues. The limited mobility of human forces when compared to emu speed became increasingly apparent as the campaign progressed, with birds capable of moving across terrain at speeds that made sustained engagement nearly impossible. Ammunition supply issues began to emerge as a critical concern, as consumption rates far exceeded pre-operation estimates. The inefficiency of current tactics was becoming apparent not only in terms of tactical outcomes, but also in terms of resource expenditure. Each dead emu was costing the military significantly more in ammunition than had been budgeted, raising questions about the long-term sustainability of the current approach. The turning point: emu supremacy. By mid-November 1932, the tactical situation had evolved to the point where neutral observers might reasonably conclude that the EMU forces had achieved local air superiority, or at least ground superiority, in their ongoing conflict with human military forces. The birds had not only adapted to the presence of machine gun fire in their environment, but had begun implementing sophisticated countermeasures that suggested a level of tactical thinking previously unseen in agricultural pest control operations. The strategic shift in emu behavior during this period represented nothing short of a revolution in animal tactical doctrine. Where individual birds had initially relied primarily on speed and dispersion to avoid human firepower, they now began operating in coordinated units that demonstrated clear evidence of command and control structures. The birds had apparently developed a communication system that allowed for coordinated responses to human activities across considerable distances, enabling them to mass forces when needed while maintaining the security advantages of dispersed operations. The establishment of what could only be described as emu safe zones represented perhaps the most sophisticated tactical development of the entire campaign. The birds had learned to identify the effective range limitations of human weapons and establish territories beyond the reach of machine gun fire where they could gather in larger numbers without fear of attack. These safe zones were positioned strategically to provide access to agricultural areas while maintaining security from human military forces. Even more remarkably, the emus had begun implementing what military analysts would recognize as supply line interdiction tactics. Rather than conducting daylight raids on crops that exposed them to potential human countermeasures, the birds learned to approach farming areas during nighttime hours when visibility conditions favored their operations. This tactical adaptation effectively eliminated the human advantage in long-range observation and fire, while allowing continued agricultural depredations. The Battle of Walgulan on November 13, 1932, would prove to be the decisive engagement that demonstrated conclusively the tactical superiority that emu forces had achieved over their human adversaries. Intelligence reports indicated the presence of over 200 birds in a formation that appeared ideal for a major military engagement. The tactical setup could hardly have been more favorable for human forces, with perfect ambush conditions and clear fields of fire that should have resulted in devastating casualties among enemy forces. Major Meredith positioned his forces with meticulous attention to conventional military doctrine, ensuring optimal firing positions while maintaining concealment from enemy observation. The approach to the target area proceeded according to textbook principles, with proper reconnaissance and security measures in place. Initial target acquisition confirmed the presence of a substantial emu formation well within effective range of the Lewis guns. The engagement commenced with 30 rounds being fired into the enemy formation, achieving what appeared to be approximately 10 confirmed casualties based on initial battle damage assessment. By conventional military standards, this represented acceptable casualty rates for the opening phase of an engagement against a large enemy formation. However, what happened next would fundamentally challenge human assumptions about the nature of their adversaries. Rather than fleeing in panic or dispersing randomly as they had during earlier engagements, the surviving emus began forming what could only be described as a defensive semicircle. This tactical maneuver demonstrated not only organizational capability, but also tactical sophistication that suggested conscious decision-making rather than instinctive animal behavior. The birds had apparently learned to respond to human fire with coordinated defensive measures designed to minimize further casualties while maintaining unit cohesion. The most unprecedented behavior occurred when the emus, having established their defensive formation, began slowly advancing toward the human gun position. This represented a complete reversal of expected animal behavior patterns and demonstrated a level of tactical audacity that confounded human military planning. The birds appeared to understand that closing distance would limit human tactical options while potentially forcing a withdrawal from prepared positions. The human response to this unexpected tactical development was immediate and telling. Rather than maintaining position and attempting to break up the emu advance through sustained fire, Major Meredith ordered what military doctrine euphemistically terms a tactical withdrawal. In practical terms, this meant that human forces abandoned their prepared positions and retreated in the face of an advancing enemy formation composed entirely of flightless birds. The psychological impact of this engagement cannot be overstated. For the first time during the campaign, human forces had been compelled to abandon prepared positions by enemy action. The fact that the enemy in question consisted of agricultural pests rather than conventional military forces made the tactical defeat particularly difficult to rationalize within existing military doctrine. Documented emu intelligence. The level of tactical sophistication demonstrated by emu forces during this period prompted closer examination of their organizational capabilities and decision-making processes. What emerged was a picture of animal intelligence and adaptability that far exceeded previous human assumptions about the cognitive capabilities of large flightless birds. The sentinel system employed by emu forces represented perhaps the most sophisticated example of their tactical evolution. Rather than relying on random chance for early warning of human activities, the birds had implemented a coordinated system of designated lookouts positioned to provide optimal observation of potential approach routes. These sentries maintained constant vigilance, while other members of their units engaged in feeding or other necessary activities. Route planning capabilities demonstrated by the emus suggested spatial reasoning abilities that enabled them to use terrain features for concealment and protection. The birds learned to approach target areas using natural depressions, vegetation, and other terrain features that minimized their exposure to human observation and fire. This represented a fundamental understanding of tactical principles that many human soldiers struggled to master. Perhaps most remarkably, the emus appeared capable of timing coordination that allowed them to conduct raids during periods when human forces were engaged in equipment maintenance or other activities that reduced their combat readiness. This suggested not only observational capabilities, but also the ability to recognize patterns in human behavior and exploit tactical opportunities when they arose. The psychological pressure tactics employed by emu forces during this period demonstrated an understanding of human psychology that was both sophisticated and effective. By surrounding human positions at distances that precluded effective engagement while maintaining visual contact, the birds created a persistent sense of being under observation and potential threat that significantly impacted human morale and operational effectiveness. Political ramifications. The military difficulties encountered during the Emu War began attracting significant political attention, as opposition parties seized upon the tactical failures as evidence of broader governmental incompetence. Press coverage intensified dramatically, with headlines shifting from initial support for military intervention to increasingly critical assessments of human tactical capabilities. The phrase, "military baffled by bird tactics," appeared in newspaper headlines with increasing frequency, creating a public relations disaster for both military and political leadership. The operation that had been intended to demonstrate governmental responsiveness to rural concerns was rapidly becoming a source of national embarrassment and international amusement. Parliamentary debates began featuring sustained questioning about military effectiveness and the wisdom of deploying armed forces against agricultural pests. Opposition politicians demanded explanations for the apparent inability of trained soldiers to overcome what they sarcastically characterized as a handful of oversized chickens. The political pressure created by these questions began affecting decision-making at the highest levels of government. Public opinion, meanwhile, began showing signs of sympathy for the EMU forces that were demonstrating such remarkable tactical capabilities. What had initially been viewed as a straightforward pest control operation was increasingly seen as an unfair fight between heavily armed humans and defenseless wild animals. The fact that the supposedly defenseless animals were winning tactical engagements only added to the irony of the situation. International attention began focusing on the conflict as news reports reached British and European newspapers. The story of Australian military forces being outmaneuvered by flightless birds provided considerable amusement to international audiences while creating diplomatic embarrassment for Australian authorities. The conflict was rapidly becoming a symbol of colonial incompetence that reflected poorly on Australian national prestige. By November 15th, the accumulated political pressure had reached the point where serious consideration was being given to suspending military operations entirely. The military assessment indicated that current tactics were proving ineffective against enemy forces that continued to demonstrate superior adaptation capabilities. Resource evaluation revealed that ammunition consumption was proceeding at unsustainable rates while achieving minimal tactical results. Success metrics for the operation were falling far short of original objectives, with EMU casualties representing only a tiny fraction of the total enemy force strength, while agricultural damage continued at previous levels. The fundamental mission of protecting crops from EMU depredation was clearly not being accomplished despite the deployment of significant military resources. The mounting criticism from political opposition, media commentary, and public opinion created an environment where continuation of military operations became increasingly difficult to justify. The operation that had begun with such confidence was rapidly approaching the point where tactical considerations would be superseded by political necessity. Major Meredith found himself in the unenviable position of commanding a military operation that was failing to achieve its stated objectives, while simultaneously becoming a source of national and international ridicule. His reports during this period reflect growing frustration with an enemy that refused to conform to conventional military expectations, while demonstrating tactical capabilities that exceeded those of many human adversaries he had faced during conventional warfare. The recognition that emu forces had achieved what could reasonably be characterized as tactical superiority represented a fundamental challenge to human assumptions about the nature of intelligence, adaptation, and warfare itself. The birds had not only learned to survive under intense military pressure, but had begun implementing offensive tactics designed to force human withdrawal from contested areas. The implications of this tactical revolution extended far beyond the immediate agricultural concerns that had prompted military intervention. The Emu War was rapidly evolving into a case study in asymmetric warfare, environmental adaptation, and the limitations of conventional military doctrine when applied to unconventional adversaries operating in familiar terrain with superior mobility and adaptation capabilities. As November 1932 drew to a close, it became increasingly apparent that the conflict had evolved beyond anything anticipated by military planners or political leadership. What had begun as a routine pest control operation had become a genuine military campaign against an enemy that demonstrated tactical sophistication, rapid adaptation, and an apparent understanding of human limitations that enabled them to exploit every weakness in conventional military doctrine. The stage was set for what would become one of the most unusual military withdrawals in modern history, as human forces found themselves compelled to acknowledge tactical defeat at the hands of an enemy that military manuals had never contemplated, and for which no established doctrine provided adequate guidance. The Great Emu War was about to enter its final phase, with consequences that would reverberate through Australian military and political circles for years to come. The Emu War's humiliating conclusion and triumphant aftermath. In the annals of military history, there are great victories that inspire generations, crushing defeats that teach valuable lessons. And then there is November 18, 1932, when the Australian military officially admitted that a bunch of large birds had outsmarted them so thoroughly that continuing the fight would only add insult to injury. What followed was perhaps the most dignified retreat in the face of the most undignified enemy in military history, and the beginning of what can only be described as the most successful victory lap ever performed by flightless birds. The story of how Australia's military machine ground to a halt in the face of feathered opposition is not just a tale of tactical failure, but a masterclass in how to turn complete humiliation into a beloved national legend. It is the story of emus who discovered they were invincible, politicians who learned the hard way that some problems cannot be solved with bullets, and farmers who found themselves living in a world where birds had become the dominant military force. As dawn broke on November 18, 1932, Major G.P.W. Meredith sat in his temporary command post near Campion, Western Australia, staring at a stack of reports that painted a picture so absurd it could have been written by a satirist with a particularly dark sense of humor. After 16 days of what military historians would later diplomatically call challenging field conditions, the time had come for what the Army termed an operational reassessment. In civilian terms, this meant admitting that they had been comprehensively outmaneuvered by animals, whose primary survival strategy involved running very fast and occasionally staring menacingly at humans. The official military review, conducted with all the bureaucratic precision that the Australian Defence Force could muster, began with the kind of language that military officials use when they need to explain the inexplicable to their superiors. The document, stamped with official seals and written in the formal terminology that makes even the most obvious disasters sound like carefully planned strategic decisions, declared that operations would be suspended pending a tactical pause for strategic evaluation. This was military speak for what everyone involved already knew. They had been beaten by birds, and continuing to pretend otherwise would only make the embarrassment worse. The unofficial reality, whispered in barracks and discussed in hushed tones in the halls of Parliament House, was considerably less diplomatic. This was not a tactical pause. This was a complete operational failure of such spectacular proportions that it defied the normal categories of military disaster. The Australian military, which had fought with distinction on the battlefields of World War I, which had faced down human enemies armed with artillery and poison gas, had been defeated by emus, whose only weapons were their legs, their beaks, and an apparently supernatural ability to make Australian soldiers look foolish. The numbers told a story that would have been unbelievable if it were not meticulously documented in official reports. Over the course of 16 days of active engagement, the military had expended approximately 2,500 rounds of ammunition. These were not casual shots fired by weekend hunters or frustrated farmers. These were military-grade .303 caliber bullets fired from Lewis machine guns by trained soldiers who had been specifically deployed to solve what the government had confidently declared to be a simple pest control problem. In exchange for this substantial investment in ammunition, logistics, and military pride, the Australian forces had achieved confirmed kills of fewer than 200 emus. Even this number was disputed, as counting enemy casualties in a war against fast-moving birds proved to be considerably more challenging than anyone had anticipated. Some emus that had been shot simply ran away, leading to debates about whether they should be counted as casualties or merely inconvenienced. Others appeared to have been killed only to be spotted the next day in different locations, leading to philosophical discussions about the nature of emu mortality and the reliability of battlefield reports. The efficiency ratio that emerged from these calculations was a number that would haunt military statisticians for decades to come. 12 rounds of ammunition per confirmed EMU casualty represented a level of tactical inefficiency that would have been embarrassing if the enemy had been human soldiers armed with comparable weapons. Against large, flightless birds whose primary defensive strategy was running away very quickly, it represented something approaching a mathematical impossibility. Major Meredith, a decorated veteran who had commanded artillery units in some of the most challenging conditions of the Great War, found himself in the unprecedented position of having to explain to his superiors how an enemy force equipped with nothing more than legs and attitude had managed to outmaneuver a military unit armed with machine guns. His reports, written with the careful precision of a man who knew that every word would be scrutinized by officials looking for someone to blame, painted a picture of an enemy that seemed to possess an almost supernatural understanding of military tactics. The emus, according to Meredith's increasingly frustrated dispatches, had demonstrated abilities that would have impressed professional military strategists. They had learned to scatter at the first sound of gunfire, adopted formation flying that minimized casualties, established sentinel systems that provided early warning of approaching soldiers, and developed what could only be described as guerrilla warfare tactics. They attacked when the humans were least prepared, withdrew when resistance was encountered, and seemed to possess an intelligence network that allowed them to coordinate activities across vast distances. More troubling still was the emus' apparent ability to learn from their mistakes faster than the humans could adapt their tactics. Early engagements had suggested that the birds were simply large, stupid targets that would be easily eliminated once proper military procedures were applied. Instead, each encounter revealed new levels of EMU sophistication that forced the military to continually revise their estimates of what they were facing. The psychological impact on the soldiers was perhaps even more significant than the tactical failures. These were men who had been trained to face human enemies, who understood the logic of conventional warfare, and who had reasonable expectations about how battles were supposed to proceed. Finding themselves outmaneuvered by birds challenged not just their professional competence, but their fundamental understanding of how the world was supposed to work. Gunnar O'Halloran, in a letter to his family that would later be preserved in the Australian War Memorial Archives, described the experience of trying to engage emus in combat as like trying to fight smoke. The birds seemed to be everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, appearing in large numbers just long enough to tempt the soldiers into setting up their equipment, then vanishing the moment the guns were ready to fire. It was, he wrote, the most frustrating thing I have ever experienced, and I fought it Gallipoli. The decision to withdraw, when it finally came, was presented to the public with all the dignity that military officials could muster. Major Meredith's recommendation to suspend operations was delivered to his superiors in language that emphasized the tactical challenges posed by the enemy's unconventional behavior rather than the simple fact that the birds had proven impossible to defeat. His report spoke of the emus' remarkable resilience and their apparent invulnerability to conventional military tactics, carefully avoiding the more direct observation that shooting birds was apparently much harder than anyone had imagined. The government's response to Meredith's recommendation was a masterpiece of political face-saving that demonstrated the kind of creative interpretation of reality that politicians excel at when confronted with disasters of their own making. Officials who had initially proclaimed the military operation as a decisive solution to the EMU problem now found themselves trying to explain why decisive solutions sometimes required tactical flexibility and strategic patience. The public announcement of the operation's conclusion was a document that would be studied by political scientists as an example of how to say absolutely nothing while using a great many words. The government declared that the military exercise had been concluded successfully, noting that valuable experience had been gained in unconventional operational environments and that the knowledge acquired would prove useful in future wildlife management initiatives. This carefully crafted statement managed to avoid mentioning several inconvenient facts: that the emus were still eating crops at exactly the same rate as before the military intervention, that the farmers who had requested help were no better off than they had been 3 weeks earlier, and that the Australian military had just suffered one of the most unusual defeats in the history of warfare. The media, however, proved less willing to accept the government's creative interpretation of events. Newspaper editors across Australia, and soon across the British Empire, seized upon the story with the kind of gleeful enthusiasm that journalists reserve for stories that are simultaneously true and unbelievable. Headlines that had begun the operation with patriotic declarations of Army tackles emu menace evolved through military faces unexpected challenges to the final unavoidable conclusion: Army retreats from emu front. The statistics that emerged from the final military reports painted a picture that was both absurd and embarrassing. 16 days of active engagement had resulted in 0 human casualties, if one did not count the severe wounds inflicted upon military pride and governmental credibility. The EMU casualties, estimated at between 180 and 200 birds, represented such a small fraction of the total emu population that their impact on the overall problem was essentially negligible. The crop damage that had prompted the military intervention continued unabated, suggesting that from the emus' perspective, the human military response had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. The political fallout from these revelations was swift and merciless. Parliamentary sessions that should have been devoted to serious matters of state governance found themselves consumed by what became known as the emu question. Opposition politicians, delighted to have discovered a government failure that was both serious and ridiculous, demanded explanations for how a military operation against birds could have consumed so many resources while achieving so little. Budget analysts, armed with calculators and a savage attention to detail, began producing figures that showed the cost per emu killed, in terms that made the operation's inefficiency impossible to ignore. The price of ammunition alone, they pointed out, exceeded the value of the crops that had been saved, assuming that any crops had actually been saved, which appeared to be a generous assumption. The military's reputation, both domestically and internationally, suffered damage that would take years to repair. Australian forces had earned respect fighting in some of the most challenging conditions of World War I, but all of that hard-won credibility was overshadowed by the simple fact that they had lost a war against birds. Military academies in other countries began using the Emu War as a case study in how conventional military thinking could fail when applied to unconventional problems, which was educational but hardly flattering. Perhaps most damaging of all was the response from the farmers who had requested military assistance in the first place. These were practical people who understood that farming involved dealing with various pests and challenges, but they had expected that military intervention would at least reduce the scale of the problem. Instead, they found themselves facing the same emu-related difficulties as before, but now with the added humiliation of knowing that their government's best efforts had been insufficient to defeat birds. Major Meredith's final report, submitted with the kind of careful professionalism that military officers maintain even in the face of the most absurd circumstances, contained what would become one of the most quoted sentences in Australian military history. The number of rounds fired per bird killed was very high, he wrote with characteristic understatement. The emus have proved that they are not susceptible to machine guns. This observation, delivered in the dry language of military reporting, captured the essential absurdity of the entire operation. Emus, it turned out, were not susceptible to machine guns, not because they were bulletproof or possessed supernatural powers, but because they were smart enough to run away when people started shooting at them. This was apparently a tactical innovation that had not been anticipated by military planners. Meredith's report went on to note that the emus had demonstrated remarkable tactical awareness and an ability to adapt to changing battlefield conditions with surprising speed. What he was describing, in military terminology, was the fact that the birds had learned not to stand around in large groups when humans with guns were nearby. This represented a level of battlefield intelligence that, while not particularly remarkable in birds, had apparently exceeded the expectations of the Australian military establishment. The withdrawal of military forces from the EMU conflict zone was conducted with all the dignity that could be mustered under the circumstances. Equipment was packed, positions were abandoned, and soldiers returned to their regular duties with the kind of studied professionalism that military personnel display when they prefer not to discuss their recent experiences. The Lewis machine guns that had failed to achieve decisive victory against the EMU forces were cleaned, serviced, and returned to armories where they would presumably be reserved for enemies that were less tactically sophisticated than large flightless birds. As the military departed, the emus remained, apparently unbothered by the brief interruption to their agricultural activities. If anything, the birds seemed more confident than before, having learned that the most dangerous predator in their environment was not actually as dangerous as they had initially assumed. The psychological impact of this discovery would prove to have consequences that extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. The emu victory, if it could be called that, was not marked by parades or celebrations, partly because emus are not known for their organizational skills, and partly because the concept of victory parades is essentially meaningless to animals whose primary concerns involve finding food and avoiding threats. Instead, the emus marked their triumph in the most practical way possible, by continuing to eat crops with what farmers reported as increased boldness and apparent satisfaction. The immediate consequences of the military withdrawal were visible within days. The emu population, which had never been seriously threatened by the military operation, continued to thrive in the agricultural areas that had become their preferred feeding grounds. If anything, the birds seemed to have gained confidence from their encounter with human military technology. Farmers reported that emus were approaching closer to farm buildings, staying longer in exposed areas, and showing less fear of human activity in general. The crop damage that had prompted the original military intervention continued at exactly the same rate as before, leading to the uncomfortable realization that 3 weeks of military operations had achieved precisely nothing in terms of solving the original problem. The emus were still eating wheat, they were still destroying fences, and they were still making life difficult for farmers who had expected that government intervention would provide meaningful relief. Farmer morale, which had briefly improved when military assistance was announced, plummeted to levels lower than before the intervention began. It was one thing to be struggling with bird problems that seemed unsolvable. It was quite another to discover that even military intervention was insufficient to address the issue. The psychological impact of this realization extended beyond simple frustration to a kind of existential despair about humanity's place in the natural order. Government credibility suffered damage that would influence Australian political discourse for years to come. The confident promises that had accompanied the announcement of military intervention were revealed to have been based on assumptions that proved to be completely wrong. Politicians who had assured voters that the EMU problem would be quickly resolved found themselves trying to explain why quick resolutions were sometimes more complicated than they appeared. The emus, meanwhile, embarked on what could only be described as a victory tour of the Western Australian wheat belt. Having discovered that humans were less dangerous than previously assumed, the birds expanded their activities into areas that they had previously avoided. Territory that had been considered relatively safe from emu incursions was suddenly subjected to raids by increasingly bold flocks that seemed to possess an enhanced understanding of their own capabilities. The continued crop raids were conducted with what farmers described as a new level of confidence. Emus that had previously been cautious about human presence now seemed almost casual in their approach to agricultural areas. They would arrive in large numbers, feed at their leisure, and depart without showing the kind of nervousness that had characterized their behavior before the military intervention. Territory expansion became a significant problem as emus moved into farming areas that had never experienced serious bird problems. The success of the Western wheat belt operations apparently convinced the emus that agricultural areas in general represented excellent feeding opportunities with minimal risk. Farmers who had previously considered themselves fortunate to be outside the emu zone found themselves dealing with bird problems for the first time. The population growth that followed the emus' successful breeding season created long-term challenges that would persist for years. The birds that had survived the military intervention were not only more confident, but also more numerous. Each successful breeding pair produced offspring that inherited both their parents' genetic advantages and their learned understanding of how to deal with human threats. Most troubling of all was the psychological dominance that the emus had established over the human population of the affected areas. Farmers reported that the birds seemed more aggressive and less respectful of human authority. What they were observing was the natural result of a species learning that its primary predator was less dangerous than originally assumed. The emus had discovered something that would have been impossible to teach them through any conventional means. Humans with guns were not invincible. This knowledge, passed through emu social networks with the efficiency that characterizes animal communication systems, fundamentally altered the relationship between humans and emus across vast areas of Western Australia. The international reaction to Australia's military defeat was swift and merciless. British newspapers, always ready to find humor in colonial misadventures, covered the story with the kind of gleeful attention typically reserved for political scandals or celebrity embarrassments. Headlines like "Colonial Forces Defeated by Native Birds" and "Empire's Smallest Military Disaster" appeared in publications across the United Kingdom, ensuring that Australia's humiliation would be shared with the widest possible audience. The British press treatment of the Emu War established a template for international coverage of Australian military affairs that would persist for decades. The story became a standard reference point for journalists looking to illustrate the unpredictable challenges of colonial administration or the occasional absurdity of military operations in unusual environments. The scientific community's response was more measured, but potentially more damaging to human pride in the long term. Researchers studying animal behavior and intelligence seized upon the Emu War as evidence of avian cognitive abilities that had been previously underestimated. Academic papers began appearing in journals devoted to animal psychology and behavioral ecology, analyzing the emu's tactical adaptations and learning curves with the kind of serious attention typically reserved for more conventional military campaigns. Dr. Herbert Whitley of the Australian Museum published a particularly influential study titled "Tactical Adaptation in Large Flightless Birds: Lessons from the Western Australian Engagement" that analyzed the emu's behavior using formal military terminology. His conclusion that the birds had demonstrated sophisticated understanding of threat assessment and tactical response was both academically rigorous and profoundly embarrassing to the military establishment. Military analysts, meanwhile, found themselves grappling with the uncomfortable implications of a conflict in which conventional military superiority had proven inadequate against an enemy that possessed no weapons other than intelligence and speed. The Emu War became a case study in asymmetric warfare, taught in military academies as an example of how technological advantages could be neutralized by superior tactics and adaptive behavior. The long-term environmental impact of the emu's victory extended far beyond the immediate agricultural areas where the conflict had taken place. The bird's success in establishing permanent populations in the wheat belt created a new ecological reality that would influence land use patterns and agricultural practices for generations. Ecosystem balance in the affected areas shifted as emus became a permanent rather than seasonal presence. The bird's feeding patterns, territory requirements, and reproductive cycles became factors that farmers and land managers had to consider when making decisions about crop selection, planting schedules, and infrastructure development. Agricultural adaptation became necessary as farmers realized that coexistence with large flightless birds was going to be a permanent feature of rural life in Western Australia. Traditional farming practices that had been developed without considering emu behavior had to be modified to account for the bird's presence, feeding patterns, and territorial requirements. Wildlife management policies underwent fundamental revision as government agencies recognized that military force was inadequate for pest control operations involving intelligent and adaptable species. The failure of the Emu War led to the development of new approaches to human-wildlife conflict that emphasized understanding animal behavior rather than simply attempting to eliminate problematic species. The recognition that military force was inadequate for pest control represented a significant shift in thinking about the relationship between humans and wildlife. The Emu War had demonstrated that some problems could not be solved through the application of superior firepower, particularly when the enemy possessed the intelligence to adapt faster than human tactics could evolve. As the dust settled on Australia's most unusual military campaign, the emus continued their agricultural activities with the satisfied air of creatures that had successfully established their place in the local hierarchy. They had learned valuable lessons about human capabilities and limitations, lessons that would serve them well in future encounters with the species that had briefly considered them a military target. The farmers returned to their daily struggles with crop protection and pest management, but now with the knowledge that government assistance might not always take the form they expected or produce the results they hoped for. The politicians moved on to other crises and other promises, but with a new understanding of the importance of managing public expectations when dealing with problems that might not have obvious solutions. The military, meanwhile, quietly filed their reports and returned their equipment to storage, preferring not to dwell on the tactical lessons learned from their encounter with large flightless birds. The Lewis machine guns that had failed to achieve decisive victory against the emu forces were eventually retired from active service, though whether this was related to their performance against avian targets remains a matter of speculation. Major Meredith's final observation that the emus have proved that they are not susceptible to machine guns became one of the most quoted sentences in Australian military history, not because it represented a profound tactical insight, but because it captured the essential absurdity of a conflict that should never have been fought in the first place. The Great Emu War had ended not with victory or defeat in any conventional sense, but with the kind of mutual exhaustion that characterizes conflicts where neither side fully understands what the other is trying to achieve. The emus had won by the simple expedient of being better at being emus than the humans were at being soldiers in an anti-emu capacity. The humans had lost by discovering that some problems are immune to military solutions, regardless of how confident the initial planning might be. In the end, the war between Australia and its emus became a legend precisely because it was so perfectly, completely, and irredeemably absurd. It was a conflict that nobody really wanted, fought by soldiers who would have preferred to be doing something else, against an enemy that was completely unaware it was at war, in service of a solution to a problem that probably should have been addressed through less dramatic means. The legacy of those 16 days in November 1932 would endure long after the immediate embarrassment had faded, serving as a reminder that nature does not always cooperate with human expectations, that military solutions are not always appropriate for civilian problems, and that sometimes the most memorable defeats are the ones that teach us to laugh at ourselves rather than cry about our limitations. The emus, for their part, continued to thrive in the Western Australian wheat belt, blissfully unaware that they had become legends in the annals of military history. They remained focused on the practical concerns of finding food, avoiding predators, and raising their young, which had served them well during their brief encounter with human military technology, and would continue to serve them well in the years to come. And so concluded one of the most unusual chapters in the history of human-animal conflict, a chapter that began with confident predictions of swift victory and ended with the recognition that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one that refuses to fight according to the rules that seem obvious to everyone else. The Great Emu War, Round 2. The sequel. Nobody asked for if there's one thing politicians excel at, it's making the same mistake twice, but with more confidence the second time around. The Great Emu War of 1932 had ended in what could generously be called a strategic withdrawal, or more accurately described as a complete and utter defeat by large flightless birds. You'd think this would be the end of the story, but you'd be underestimating the remarkable ability of government officials to ignore obvious lessons when faced with political pressure. By 1934, the emus had apparently forgotten to read the peace treaty that was never signed, because they were back to their old habits of treating Western Australian wheat fields like an all-you-can-eat buffet. The birds had spent the intervening 2 years doing what emus do best: eating, running around, and apparently holding strategy meetings about how to most effectively annoy farmers. They had also been busy doing something else emus excel at: making more emus. The population had not only recovered from the military's modest culling efforts, but had actually grown, as if the birds were deliberately thumbing their beaks at the Australian Defence Force. The farmers, understandably frustrated by their continuing feathered tormentors, began what could only be described as a lobbying campaign. Picture, if you will, sun-weathered men in wide-brimmed hats marching into government offices in Perth, demanding action with the righteous indignation of people who had been promised military assistance and received what amounted to an expensive fireworks display that scared exactly nobody, least of all the emus. Their message was simple and direct: you started this fight, now finish it. It was the political equivalent of your older brother starting a fight with the school bully, getting thoroughly beaten, and then being demanded by your parents to go back and sort it out properly. The new crop damage reports made for grim reading, assuming you were a farmer or a politician who had to face said farmers. The emus had returned with what could only be described as renewed vigor and possibly a sense of invincibility. They had learned, it seemed, that humans made a lot of noise but were remarkably ineffective at actually stopping them. This was like giving a teenager the car keys after they had already crashed the family sedan. You knew it was going to end badly, but somehow you convinced yourself that maybe, just maybe, things would be different this time. The military, to their credit, approached the prospect of round 2 with all the enthusiasm of a person being asked to have root canal surgery without anesthesia. The officers who had been involved in the original campaign were presumably having flashbacks involving the distinctive booming calls of emus and the sound of machine guns jamming at precisely the wrong moment. Major Meredith, who had led the original expedition, was probably hoping for a nice quiet posting somewhere far away from anything with feathers. But political pressure has a way of overriding common sense, military experience, and basic lessons in cause and effect. The government, faced with angry farmers, embarrassing newspaper headlines, and the sort of political heat that makes re-election campaigns very uncomfortable, made the decision that seemed logical to people who had never actually tried to fight emus. They authorized Operation Emu 2, the sequel that nobody in the military wanted, but everybody in agriculture demanded. The decision-making process probably went something like this: well, we didn't do very well the first time, but surely we've learned something. We'll do it differently this time. How hard can it be to defeat some oversized chickens? This is the same type of thinking that leads people to believe that the second Death Star would somehow be less vulnerable than the first one, despite being built with the exact same fundamental design flaw. Operation Emu-2, The Empire Strikes Back. If the first Emu War was characterized by overconfidence and conventional military thinking, the second campaign was marked by what military strategists might generously call adaptive tactics, and what everyone else would recognize as trying anything that might work because we're running out of ideas. The military planners, having been thoroughly educated in the realities of EMU warfare, decided to abandon the grand, set-piece battles that had worked so poorly in 1932. The new strategy was elegantly simple in theory: smaller units, greater mobility, and hit-and-run tactics. Instead of setting up machine gun positions and waiting for the emus to conveniently group themselves for slaughter, the military would take the fight to the birds using mobile units that could theoretically outmaneuver their feathered opponents. This was military thinking at its finest. If you can't beat them with firepower, try to beat them with cleverness. The problem with this approach, as the military was about to rediscover, was that it assumed emus were static targets who hadn't learned anything from their previous encounters with humans bearing firearms. This was roughly equivalent to assuming that your opponent in chess would make exactly the same moves in the second game as they had in the first, despite having been thoroughly beaten the first time around. The emus, meanwhile, had spent the intervening 2 years doing what could only be described as continuous military exercises. They had refined their scatter patterns, improved their communication systems, and developed what modern military analysts might recognize as effective counterinsurgency tactics. They had also, and this cannot be overstated, gotten very good at recognizing the sound of approaching vehicles and the distinctive silhouette of humans carrying weapons. The mobile tactics that looked so promising in the planning stages quickly ran into the harsh realities of emu intelligence and Australian terrain. The smaller military units would approach an area reported to have emu activity, only to find that the birds had somehow received advance warning and had relocated to somewhere else entirely. It was as if the emus had developed their own intelligence network, complete with forward observers and rapid communication systems. When contact was finally established, the results were depressingly familiar. The emus would scatter at the first sound of gunfire, moving with the sort of coordinated precision that would have impressed a drill sergeant. They had learned to use terrain features for cover, to split into smaller groups that were harder to target effectively, and to regroup once the immediate threat had passed. Watching a flock of emus execute these maneuvers was probably like watching a masterclass in small unit tactics, except the instructors were large, flightless birds who had never read a military manual. The mobile tactics also suffered from a fundamental logistical problem. Emus are remarkably fast and have excellent endurance, while military vehicles in 1934 were neither particularly fast nor particularly reliable. Pursuing emus across the Western Australian countryside was like trying to catch greyhounds while riding in a farm tractor. Theoretically possible, but practically frustrating and ultimately futile. The ammunition consumption rates were, if anything, worse than during the first campaign. The smaller units meant less concentrated firepower, which meant more rounds fired per target engaged. The mobile tactics meant more ammunition expended on targets of opportunity that turned out to be no opportunity at all. The end result was a lot of noise, a lot of expense, and a modest number of emu casualties that made absolutely no difference to the overall population. The duration of Operation Emu 2 was mercifully shorter than the original campaign, partly because the military had learned to recognize futility more quickly, and partly because the government was becoming increasingly reluctant to fund what was looking more and more like an expensive form of military theater. The outcome was another tactical withdrawal. Though by this point, the euphemisms were wearing thin, and everyone involved was beginning to acknowledge that what they were really doing was retreating from birds. The ongoing struggle. Having conclusively demonstrated that the Australian military was not equipped to handle large-scale emu management, the government pivoted to what economists call market-based solutions, and what everyone else recognized as paying other people to deal with the problem we couldn't solve ourselves. The bounty system was elegantly simple. The government would pay a fixed amount for each dead emu and let civilian hunters sort out the details. This approach had several advantages over military intervention. First, it was cheaper, since the government only paid for results rather than funding entire military operations that might or might not achieve anything. Second, it utilized local knowledge and hunting skills that were far better suited to the task than military tactics designed for fighting other humans. Third, and perhaps most importantly, it distributed the embarrassment of struggling with emus across a wider population rather than concentrating it in the military. The civilian hunters approached the emu problem with the sort of practical mindset that comes from actually needing to succeed rather than simply following orders. They used techniques that had been developed over decades of hunting in the Australian bush: patience, local knowledge, and an understanding of animal behavior that no military manual could provide. They also had the advantage of not being constrained by military protocols, official reporting requirements, or the need to justify their tactics to government committees. The bounty hunters were more successful than the military had been, but even they found that emus were formidable opponents. The birds had learned to associate humans with danger, and their natural wariness had been sharpened by their encounters with military forces. They had developed sophisticated avoidance behaviors and had apparently passed these lessons on to their offspring, creating a generation of emus that were naturally suspicious of human activity. The hunting campaign became a war of attrition that stretched across more than a decade. Individual hunters might have good days when they encountered unwary flocks, but the overall emu population proved remarkably resilient. For every emu that was shot, it seemed like two more appeared to take its place. The birds were breeding successfully, adapting to human pressure, and generally demonstrating the sort of biological persistence that makes species successful in evolutionary terms. The farmers, meanwhile, were learning their own lessons about coexistence with large flightless birds. Some developed more effective fencing systems. Others changed their planting schedules to avoid peak emu migration periods, and a few even began to view the occasional emu raid as a manageable cost of doing business in the Australian bush. This was adaptation in action, humans learning to work around a natural phenomenon rather than trying to eliminate it entirely. By the late 1940s, the emu problem had gradually faded from political prominence, not because it had been solved, but because everyone involved had learned to live with it. The emus were still there, still occasionally raiding crops, but the initial panic had been replaced by a more measured understanding of the situation. The bounty system continued, but at a reduced level, and the military had moved on to deal with more pressing concerns, like the small matter of World War II. The total cost of the various anti-emu campaigns, when calculated over the entire period, was significantly higher than the original crop damage that had prompted the first military intervention. This was a perfect example of what economists call problem escalation, where the cost of solving a problem exceeds the cost of the problem itself. It was also a demonstration of the law of unintended consequences, where government intervention creates new problems that are more expensive and complex than the original issue. The Great Emu War and its various sequels and spin-offs provided a remarkable case study in the intersection of military strategy, animal behavior, political decision-making, and human adaptability. Like many historical events that seem absurd in retrospect, it offered valuable lessons that extended far beyond the specific circumstances of 1930s Western Australia. Military lessons, when conventional wisdom meets unconventional opponents. The most obvious military lesson from the Emu War was that conventional tactics, designed for fighting conventional enemies, were spectacularly unsuited for dealing with unconventional opponents. The Australian military had approached the emu problem using strategies and equipment designed for fighting other human armies, with predictably poor results. Machine guns, for example, are excellent weapons for suppressing enemy infantry or destroying light vehicles, but they are remarkably ineffective against small, fast-moving targets that scatter at the first sign of trouble. This was a lesson that would be repeated in various forms throughout the 20th century, as military forces around the world discovered that irregular opponents, whether they were guerrilla fighters, insurgents, or large flightless birds, required different approaches than conventional warfare. The Emu campaign was an early example of what would later be recognized as asymmetric warfare, where one side's advantages in equipment and organization were neutralized by the other side's advantages in mobility, local knowledge, and adaptability. The speed of enemy adaptation was another crucial lesson. The emus learned from each encounter with human forces, modifying their behavior based on experience, and apparently communicating these lessons to other members of their species. Within days of the first military engagement, emu flocks were displaying coordinated evasion tactics that suggested both intelligence and social learning. This was a faster adaptation than military planners had anticipated, and it rendered many tactical assumptions obsolete almost immediately. The importance of terrain and home field advantage became painfully obvious during both military campaigns. The emus were operating in their natural habitat, with intimate knowledge of local geography, seasonal patterns, and available resources. The military forces, by contrast, were operating in unfamiliar territory, dependent on local guides, and limited by their equipment's suitability for the environment. The vast distances involved in Western Australia meant that military units could be easily avoided by opponents who knew the landscape and could move across it more efficiently. Resource efficiency emerged as a critical factor that military planners had apparently not considered carefully enough. The ammunition expenditure per target engaged was astronomically high compared to conventional military operations, and the logistical costs of maintaining forces in remote areas added significantly to the overall expense. When the cost of military intervention exceeded the economic damage caused by the original problem, the entire rationale for the operation became questionable. These lessons would prove relevant to military planners facing irregular opponents in various contexts throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. The fundamental insight that superior firepower and conventional organization do not guarantee success against adaptive, mobile opponents operating on familiar terrain would be rediscovered repeatedly in conflicts around the world. Scientific insights. Understanding animal intelligence and adaptation. From a scientific perspective, the Emu War provided valuable insights into animal intelligence, social learning, and behavioral adaptation that were ahead of their time. Modern research has confirmed many of the observations made by frustrated military personnel during the 1930s campaigns. Emu intelligence, as demonstrated during the conflict, includes sophisticated problem-solving abilities, social learning, and behavioral flexibility. The bird's ability to modify their group behavior based on experience, communicate danger signals across distances, and coordinate evasion tactics suggested cognitive abilities that were not widely recognized at the time. Modern studies of emu behavior have confirmed that these birds possess considerable intelligence, including the ability to use tools, solve complex problems, and engage in strategic thinking. The speed of behavioral adaptation displayed by emu populations during the military campaigns was remarkable by any standard. Within days of initial contact with human forces, entire flocks were displaying modified behavior patterns that suggested both individual learning and social transmission of information. This rapid adaptation demonstrated the plasticity of animal behavior and the effectiveness of social learning systems in wild populations. The ecological implications of human intervention became apparent as the campaigns progressed. The military operations disrupted normal emu migration patterns, altered feeding behaviors, and changed the relationship between emus and human settlements. These changes had cascading effects on other species and on agricultural practices, demonstrating the interconnectedness of ecological systems and the difficulty of predicting the consequences of intervention. Conservation psychology, though not recognized as a distinct field at the time, was illustrated by the emu population's responses to human pressure. The birds developed increased wariness, modified their habitat use patterns, and apparently transmitted these behavioral changes to their offspring. This demonstrated how animal populations adapt to human threats and highlighted the importance of understanding animal behavior in conservation and management contexts. These scientific insights would prove valuable for wildlife management, conservation biology, and animal behavior studies. The Emu War provided an inadvertent natural experiment in human-wildlife conflict that generated data about animal adaptation, intelligence, and ecological relationships that would inform scientific understanding for decades to come. Political lessons, media, military deployment, and public expectations. The political dimensions of the Emu War offered equally valuable lessons about media management, appropriate use of military forces, and the challenges of managing public expectations in democratic societies. Media management emerged as a critical factor that government officials had apparently not considered adequately. What began as a local agricultural problem became a national embarrassment, partly because of how the story was presented to the public. The initial media coverage portrayed the military intervention as a straightforward pest control operation, creating expectations that were impossible to meet. When the reality of the situation became apparent, the media narrative shifted to focus on military incompetence and government foolishness, amplifying the political damage. The appropriate deployment of military forces became a contentious issue that extended beyond the specific circumstances of the Emu campaign. Using military personnel and equipment for civilian pest control problems raised questions about the proper role of armed forces in peacetime and the cost-effectiveness of military solutions to non-military problems. The poor results of both Emu campaigns contributed to more careful consideration of when and how military resources should be deployed for civilian purposes. Agricultural policy lessons emerged from the recognition that prevention might have been more effective than reaction. The EMU problem was partly a result of human modifications to the landscape that disrupted natural migration patterns and created concentrated food sources. More thoughtful agricultural planning might have reduced the severity of the problem without requiring military intervention. Public expectation management proved to be one of the most challenging aspects of the entire affair. Farmers had legitimate concerns about crop damage and deserved government assistance, but their expectations about what military intervention could accomplish were unrealistic. The government failed to adequately communicate the limitations of military action against wildlife populations, leading to disappointment and political backlash when results fell short of promises. These political lessons would prove relevant to government officials dealing with various types of public pressure and media attention. The Emu War demonstrated the importance of realistic goal setting, clear communication about limitations and trade-offs, and careful consideration of unintended consequences before committing to high-profile government interventions. The lessons learned from the Emu War have found applications in various modern contexts, from pest control and wildlife management to military planning and environmental policy. Pest control strategies have evolved to emphasize integrated management approaches that combine multiple techniques rather than relying on single solutions. Modern wildlife managers recognize that successful control of problem species requires understanding of animal behavior, ecological relationships, and long-term population dynamics. The failure of purely military approaches to EMU management contributed to the development of more sophisticated and effective wildlife management strategies. Wildlife conservation efforts have benefited from improved understanding of animal intelligence, social learning, and behavioral adaptation. The recognition that wildlife populations can adapt quickly to human interventions has influenced conservation strategies and management practices. Modern conservation programs emphasize the importance of understanding animal behavior and ecological relationships, rather than simply applying generic solutions. Military planning, particularly for irregular warfare and counterinsurgency operations, has incorporated lessons about the importance of understanding opponents, adapting to local conditions, and considering the limitations of conventional approaches. The Emu War's demonstration of how adaptive, mobile opponents can neutralize superior firepower and organization has informed military thinking about asymmetric conflicts. Environmental management policies increasingly recognize the complexity of ecological systems and the difficulty of predicting the consequences of intervention. The Emu War's illustration of unintended consequences and ecological interconnectedness has contributed to more cautious and thoughtful approaches to environmental problem solving. These modern applications demonstrate that the lessons of the Emu War, despite their seemingly absurd context, have had lasting relevance for understanding complex systems, adaptive opponents, and the limitations of conventional approaches to unconventional problems. How emus became legends. The transformation of the Great Emu War from embarrassing military failure to beloved cultural legend represents one of the most remarkable examples of how a nation can turn a source of shame into a source of pride through the simple expedient of learning to laugh at itself. What began as a serious attempt to solve an agricultural problem became, over time, one of Australia's most cherished historical anecdotes and a testament to the country's ability to find humor in adversity. Cultural impact: the power of self-deprecating humor. Australian humor has always been characterized by a willingness to laugh at authority, celebrate underdogs, and find comedy in disaster. The Emu War provided perfect material for this national tendency toward self-deprecation. Here was a story that had everything: pompous officials making grandiose promises, military forces being outwitted by birds, and an outcome so absurd that it defied belief. The story became a staple of Australian storytelling, passed down through generations as an example of what happens when bureaucrats and military planners underestimate both the complexity of natural systems and the intelligence of their opponents. It became a cautionary tale about overconfidence, a celebration of the natural world's resilience, and a reminder that sometimes the best response to failure is a good laugh and a willingness to try a different approach. Australian comedians, writers, and storytellers embraced the Emu War as source material, finding in it endless opportunities for humor about military incompetence, political foolishness, and the fundamental absurdity of human attempts to control nature. The story appeared in comedy routines, satirical articles, and humorous retellings that emphasized the David and Goliath nature of the conflict. Except in this version, David was a large, flightless bird, and Goliath was the entire Australian military establishment. The international recognition of the Emu War as one of the world's most famous military defeats became, paradoxically, a source of national pride. Australians discovered that other countries found the story hilarious rather than embarrassing, and that international audiences appreciated Australia's willingness to acknowledge and laugh about its failures. This external validation helped transform the story from a source of potential shame into a demonstration of Australian character and humor. Tourism opportunities eventually developed around Emu War sites, with visitors coming to see the locations where the great battles had taken place. Local tour guides learned to tell the story with appropriate dramatic flair, and historical markers were erected to commemorate the sites where Australian military forces had been bested by birds. This transformation of embarrassment into tourist attraction demonstrated the economic value of historical humor and the power of narrative to reshape perception. Educational applications of the Emu War story extended beyond Australia, as military academies around the world began using it as an example of unconventional warfare, the importance of understanding your opponent, and the limitations of conventional military thinking. The story became a case study in military schools, business schools, and public policy programs as an illustration of how assumptions, overconfidence, and failure to adapt can lead to spectacular failures. Modern emu status, from enemy to national symbol. The emus themselves have experienced a remarkable transformation in status since their military victory in the 1930s. Modern emu populations are thriving across Australia, having successfully established themselves as a permanent part of the continent's ecological and cultural landscape. Their population numbers are stable and healthy, a testament to their adaptability and resilience. Legal protection for emus has been established in most Australian states, recognizing their ecological importance and their status as native wildlife. This legal recognition represents a complete reversal from the 1930s, when emus were considered agricultural pests to be eliminated by any means necessary. The transformation reflects changing attitudes toward wildlife, improved understanding of ecological relationships, and recognition of the value of biodiversity. The appearance of the emu on Australia's coat of arms, alongside the kangaroo, represents perhaps the ultimate irony of the entire story. Here is an animal that defeated the Australian military being honored as a national symbol, representing the country's character and values. The symbolism is particularly rich given that both animals on the coat of arms are unable to walk backward, supposedly representing Australia's commitment to moving forward rather than dwelling on the past. Economic value has developed around emus in various forms, from tourism related to emu war sites to commercial emu farming for meat, oil, and leather products. The birds that were once seen as purely destructive pests are now recognized as having economic potential, contributing to rural economies and providing sustainable livelihood opportunities for some farmers. The transformation of emus from agricultural enemy to cultural icon demonstrates how perceptions can change over time and how what seems like disaster in one era can become celebration in another. The birds that once terrorized wheat farmers and humiliated military forces are now beloved characters in Australia's national story. Historical recognition, academic interest, and popular culture. Academic interest in the Emu War has grown significantly over time, with historians, military analysts, animal behaviorists, and cultural scholars finding various aspects of the story worthy of serious study. Multiple academic papers have been published examining different dimensions of the conflict, from military history and strategy to animal behavior and ecological relationships. Military historians have analyzed the Emu War as an early example of asymmetric warfare, examining how conventional military forces struggled against unconventional opponents. These studies have contributed to broader understanding of irregular warfare, the importance of adapting tactics to specific circumstances, and the limitations of superior firepower against adaptive opponents. Animal behavior researchers have used historical accounts of EMU behavior during the military campaigns to understand intelligence, social learning, and adaptation in wild populations. The detailed observations made by frustrated military personnel during the 1930s have provided valuable data about EMU cognition and behavior that has informed modern scientific understanding. Cultural studies scholars have examined the Emu War as an example of how national narratives develop and change over time. The transformation of the story from embarrassing failure to beloved legend illustrates how societies process and reinterpret their histories, finding meaning and value in unexpected places. Documentary features about the Emu War have appeared regularly on historical programs, nature documentaries, and comedy shows. The story's combination of historical significance, natural history interest, and inherent humor makes it perfect material for various types of programming. These documentaries have helped spread awareness of the story beyond Australia and have contributed to its status as a globally recognized historical curiosity. Internet fame has given the Emu War story new life in the digital age, with social media content, memes, and viral videos introducing the story to new generations and international audiences. The absurd nature of the conflict makes it perfect material for internet humor, and the story regularly resurfaces in various online formats, ensuring its continued relevance and recognition. Educational use of the Emu War story has expanded beyond military academies to include business schools, public policy programs, and environmental studies courses. The story's lessons about assumption making, adaptation, unintended consequences, and the complexity of natural systems make it valuable teaching material for various disciplines. The ultimate irony of the Emu War story lies in the fact that one of the animals that defeated the Australian military now appears as a national symbol on the country's coat of arms. This is not just coincidence, but rather a deliberate choice that reflects Australia's values and national character in ways that the original designers of the coat of arms could never have anticipated. The coat of arms features both an emu and a kangaroo as supporters, holding up the shield that represents the Australian nation. The traditional explanation for choosing these animals is that neither can walk backward, symbolizing Australia's commitment to moving forward rather than dwelling on past mistakes or failures. This symbolism takes on additional layers of meaning when considered in light of the Emu War story. The emu's presence on the coat of arms represents a remarkable rehabilitation from military enemy to national symbol. This transformation reflects Australia's ability to acknowledge its mistakes, learn from them, and ultimately find humor and meaning in experiences that might otherwise be sources of embarrassment. The choice to honor an animal that had bested the military demonstrates a mature national character that values honesty and self-reflection over false pride. The backward-walking symbolism becomes particularly poignant when applied to the Emu War story. Australia's willingness to acknowledge the absurdity of the conflict, learn from its mistakes, and move forward with better approaches to wildlife management demonstrates exactly the kind of forward thinking that the coat of arms is supposed to represent. National pride in the Emu War story represents a sophisticated form of patriotism that celebrates national character rather than military victories. Australians have found that their country's ability to laugh at itself, acknowledge failures, and learn from mistakes is more worthy of pride than any conventional military triumph would have been. This represents a mature understanding of what makes a nation truly strong. The transformation of the Emu War from source of shame to source of pride illustrates how national narratives can evolve and how the same events can be interpreted in radically different ways depending on perspective and context. What seemed like unmitigated disaster in the 1930s became, over time, a demonstration of Australian resilience, humor, and character. In the end, the Great Emu War and its various sequels and spin-offs created a situation where everyone emerged as winners, albeit not in the ways that anyone originally intended. The emus won by successfully defending their territory, maintaining their population, and eventually achieving protected status and national recognition. The farmers won by eventually learning to coexist with their feathered neighbors and finding more effective management strategies. The military won by learning valuable lessons about unconventional warfare and the limitations of conventional approaches. The politicians won by eventually finding solutions that satisfied their constituents without requiring further embarrassing military interventions. Most importantly, Australia as a nation won by demonstrating that it could acknowledge failure, learn from mistakes, and transform embarrassment into cultural treasure through the simple expedient of maintaining a sense of humor about itself. The Emu War became proof that national strength lies not in never failing, but in failing gracefully and learning from the experience. The story continues to resonate because it captures something essential about the human condition: our tendency to overestimate our control over natural systems, our ability to learn and adapt when our assumptions prove wrong, and our capacity to find humor and meaning in even the most absurd circumstances. In a world that often takes itself too seriously, the Great Emu War serves as a reminder that sometimes the best response to defeat is a good laugh and a commitment to doing better next time. The emus, for their part, continue to roam the Australian landscape, blissfully unaware of their status as military legends and national symbols. They go about their daily business of eating, running, and occasionally startling tourists who encounter them unexpectedly. They represent the enduring power of nature to surprise, humble, and ultimately teach us about the complexity and wonder of the world we share. And somewhere in the Australian bush, when the wind is just right and the light is fading, you might hear the distinctive booming call of an emu echoing across the landscape. It sounds a bit like laughter, and perhaps in a way, it is.